sky should never scream. But that day, over Ryloth, it did. Fire rolled through the clouds. Separatist ships hovered above the world like watching predators. Every explosion shook the ground. Every scream vanished into smoke. The Clone Wars had reached the surface. A Republic Y-wing tore through the atmosphere, trailing fire. Its engines were failing. Its stabilizers were gone. The pilot was already dead. Locked inside the astromech socket was a single droid. He had no reputation, no history worth remembering, only a designation stamped into his core. Chopper, C1-10P. Not built to think, not built to feel, built to assist until destruction. The ship spiraled downward. There was no ejection protocol for him, no survival command, only vibration, heat, and falling. The ground rushed up, then impact. The crash did not explode. Metal screamed as the hull split open. One wing snapped away. The cockpit folded inward. Silence followed. Smoke drifted across the rocks. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, a weak mechanical sound. A damaged dome pushed upward through the wreckage. One optic flickered, the other remained dark. Chopper, C1-10P, was still online. His left leg was gone. His right arm sparked violently. Internal alarms flooded his systems. Cooling failure, structural instability, memory fragmentation warnings. But his core still functioned. So he moved, slowly, painfully, dragging metal through dust. He exited the ruined Y-wing and stopped beside it. His prime directive activated. Assist pilot. There was no pilot. The command looped again, and again, and again. Unable to complete it, he simply waited. The sun lowered over Ryloth. Ash fell from the sky like grey snow. He scanned for Republic signals. None answered. He searched for clone comm frequencies. Only static returned. Eventually, he stopped scanning. He remained beside the ship, unmoving, forgotten. Footsteps approached, small, careful. A young Twi'lek girl emerged from behind the rocks. She did not wear armor. She carried no weapon, only grief. Her name was Hera. Her mother had died days earlier, killed in the same war that left this wreck behind. She should have been afraid. Instead, she stepped closer. She studied the destroyed ship, then the broken droid beside it. Chopper, C1-10P, turned his dome toward her. His shock prod still functioned. His defense systems were active, but he did nothing. The girl knelt in front of him. No words were spoken. The war had already taken enough of those. She reached out and placed her hand on his scorched dome. He did not pull away. Something in his systems paused. A command interrupted another. Not a protocol, not a function. Something else. She returned the next day, and the next, each time bringing tools scavenged from ruins. Old Republic scrap, loose wiring, broken components. She didn't know how to repair droids, but she tried anyway. She replaced his leg with mismatched parts. She sealed exposed wiring. She stabilized his power core. His voice module could not be repaired fully. From that moment on, his sounds would always stutter, always rasp, always feel damaged. She never fixed that. She said it made him unique. Eventually, she gave him a name. Chopper. A simple word. Rough. Uneven. Just like him. From that day forward, he was no longer scrap. No longer war debris. He followed her everywhere, through camps, through hideouts, through quiet nights filled with fear. He did not understand love, but he understood her, and that was enough. This was not the beginning of a rebellion. This was the beginning of loyalty. A girl who had lost her mother, A droid who had lost his purpose, sitting beside a crashed ship, while the war continued above them. And neither of them knew that this broken moment would one day echo across the galaxy. War doesn't always take everything at once. Sometimes it takes pieces. It took Hera's mother, then it took her father's attention. And somewhere between those two wounds, it took her childhood. She was just a girl when she found the wreck, but she had already learned how to survive, how to listen without speaking, how to hide pain in silence. She kept returning. Every day, every storm, every danger. Not because she had to, because something inside her told her that he was still alive, even if no one else thought droids could be. And he was. Not just active, but aware. He had never been meant to last. Chopper. C1-10P was already past his expiration protocol. His parts were out of production. His systems had been patched and repatched over years of frontline service. He should have been replaced, scrapped, forgotten. But he wasn't, because she wouldn't let him be. Her hands were small, her tools were salvaged. Her instructions came from memory, not manuals. Still, she repaired him. Each bolt she turned brought him closer to something droids were never promised. A second life. But his body remembered the crash. His left leg never moved the same way again. One side of his dome would always be scorched, and the Y-wing that nearly killed him. He would never forgive it. Even years later, he would bark and whine when someone mentioned a Y-wing. He wouldn't ride in one, wouldn't approach one. Some trauma, even in droids, leaves a scar that memory chips cannot erase. Chopper, C1-10P, never spoke about the war, but it lived inside him, in his motions, sensors, in his mismatched limb, in the way he growled when someone touched his rebuilt arm. Hera never asked what he had seen. She didn't need to. They shared the same silence, the same shadows behind their eyes, the same ache that never fully left. In each other, they found something they had both lost. Not family, not purpose, just presence. And when everything else was burning, sometimes that was enough. Others didn't understand. They called him defective, annoying, unstable. He shocked people who touched him without warning. He stole tools from repair crews. He refused to respond to direct commands unless they came from Hera. But she never corrected him, because she knew what he was. He wasn't broken. He was choosing who to be. At night, when the campfires dimmed and the sky turned cold, he stayed close to her. Not because he was programmed to, because he wanted to. Sometimes he would power down beside her. Other times, she would wake to see a single optic glowing in the dark, still watching the horizon, not out of fear, out of habit. One day, Hera asked him a question, a simple one. If I leave, will you come with me? There was no hesitation, no need for translation. He spun his dome in a circle, raised his arm, let out a long, sarcastic beep. Of course he would. Not because he was a navigator, not because he was a droid, but because he didn't want to be left behind again. Some bonds are forged in fire, others in silence. Theirs was built in both. One child who had no mother, one droid who had no legs. And together, they had just enough to keep moving forward. Some droids forget the wars they serve in. Memory wipes are easy. They're routine, simple. But Chopper, C1-10P, was never wiped. Not once. Whether by neglect or intention, his mind remained untouched. And so the war lived on inside him. Not just in data logs, but in his movements, his reflexes, his anger. It was always there, buzzing just beneath his armor. He never liked being touched. Even years later, if someone grabbed his arm too fast, he would lash out with his shock prod, hard, fast, without hesitation. If someone walked too close from behind, he'd spin his dome and flash a warning light. A behavior copied from battlefield protocols. No one trained him to be this way. The war did. And the war had never ended. Not for him. When Hera brought him aboard the Ghost, he claimed the engine room as his own. At first, the crew thought it was funny, quirky. But over time, they realized the truth. He didn't trust anyone else with the ship. Because ships fail. Pilots die. Wars crash down from the sky. So he rewired every system by himself. Alone. Silently. And in doing so, he made sure he would never be helpless again. There was one system he never touched. The Y-Wing database. Whenever the word came up, his tone shifted, rougher, meaner. Even Hera knew not to push him. He would never explain why, but the hatred was real. One day, Kanan tried to joke about it. "Come on, Chop, it's just a ship." Chopper, C1-10P, wheeled away without a sound. And later that night, Kanan found one of his boots sealed to the floor with industrial adhesive. Sabine once tried painting over his scars. She thought it would be kind. But when he powered on and saw what she'd done, he wiped the entire panel clean. Not gently. He left the brush cracked and the paint scattered. He didn't want to be cleaned. He wanted to be remembered. There were nights when the ship was silent, too quiet. And in those hours, Hera would hear him in the corridors, muttering. Not words, not speech, just mechanical rambling, old alerts, warning tones, half-formed sounds from systems that should have failed years ago. They echoed through the metal like voices of the dead. Once, Ezra asked why he talked to himself. Hera only said, "He's not talking to himself. He's talking to what's gone." Ezra didn't ask again. Battle droids, clone commands, explosion diagnostics, static from long-dead comms. It all still lived inside him. He never deleted anything. He never needed to. Pain wasn't something to be erased. It was something to remember. Because remembering meant control. And control meant survival. Sometimes he would sit in the cockpit alone, watching hyperspace stream past, not moving, not beeping, not scanning, just watching, waiting, as if somewhere in the stars. The war he lost was still out there, unawaiting to call him back. He was sarcastic, unstable, defiant, but he never left his post. He never failed the Ghost. He never abandoned Hera. Chopper, C1-10P, was not loyal because he was built to be. He was loyal because he chose to be, and that choice cost him more than anyone could understand. Ryloth was still broken. Even after the Clone Wars ended, the Empire stayed. Stormtroopers replaced droids. Tyranny changed helmets, but not purpose. People whispered of rebellion, of resistance. But whispers don't stop Star Destroyers. Hera was older now, still quiet, still watching. But her silence had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was decision. She was going to leave, not to escape, but to fight. Chopper, C1-10P, didn't ask why. He didn't try to stop her, didn't calculate odds, didn't evaluate survival metrics. He just packed himself into the transport's maintenance bay and powered down, waiting for launch. She found him there, sparks flickering under his dome, oil streaked across his mismatched leg. "You weren't invited," she said softly. He spun his dome once, let out a low, defiant groan. Of course he was coming. He had no interest in politics, no stake in strategy. no desire to topple governments. But wherever she went, that's where he would be. Not because he owed her, not because he was programmed to obey, but because she was the only one who ever made him feel real. Their first ship wasn't the Ghost. It was smaller, louder, barely held atmosphere. But to him, it felt safe. Because she was there. Because he was needed again. He kept the engines stable, patched the hull with spare plates, wired the door controls to respond only to his signal. It wasn't loyalty, it was protection. He had lost one cockpit. He wouldn't lose another. They moved from mission to mission, delivering supplies, listening to broken people whisper of freedom. And always, Chopper, C1-10P was there, sabotaging enemy ships, jamming transmissions, locking blast doors just in time. No medals, no gratitude, just survival. One night, she was nearly captured. Imperial agents surrounded the outpost. She ran, wounded, barely conscious. He found her, dragged her to the freighter himself, piloted them through a hail of blaster fire. And when the comms went dead, he sent out an emergency ping in every old Republic frequency he could remember. Help came. She lived. He never told her what he had done. She never asked. Later, she would gather others, a Jedi with a haunted past, a Mandalorian girl who spoke through art, a Lasat warrior who had lost his people, a boy who would one day carry a flame far beyond what any of them expected. But before them all, there was only him, only Chopper, C1-10P at her side, as he had always been, as he would always be. Years from now, people would look back at the rebellion and remember ships, battles, heroes. But they would forget the droid in the background, the one who rewired escape hatches mid-battle, the one who jammed the signal before it was traced, the one who dragged a wounded captain through the dark without ever expecting to be thanked. But none of that mattered to him. He hadn't followed her to be remembered. He followed her because she was the only thing he had left to follow. And so began the long road of Spectre 3. Before the titles, before the Phoenix Fleet, before victory. It began with fire, with a crash, with a broken dome and a girl who refused to leave him behind. Chopper, C1-10P wasn't built for rebellion, but he became it anyway. Because when Hera left, he did not let her go alone. The ship was barely holding together. Burned plates, mismatched panels, a sound in the engines that no mechanic could fully silence. She was a patchwork vessel, too old for front lines, too damaged for military use, too independent for a port registry. She wasn't supposed to fly, but she did. They called her the Ghost. To strangers, she looked like a freighter, old Corellian parts, faded paint, a working-class ship with no allegiance. But to Chopper, C1-10P, she was more than transport. She was memory. She was a new cockpit with just enough room for one pilot and a droid who never sat still. At first, she wasn't home. He didn't trust her. The wiring layout was wrong. The engine ports were too loud. The auxiliary power loop made his motivator twitch every time it cycled. He muttered. He banged tools against the walls. He rerouted systems without asking. But slowly, she began to change, not because he adapted, because he made her adapt to him. He rewired the ventilation ducts so he could move through them faster, installed his own custom ports into every subsystem, welded shut the escape pod controls, just in case someone ever tried to leave without him. He wasn't a guest. He was part of the ship now. And every time she groaned in hyperspace, he was the one who listened. Chopper, C1-10P, didn't believe in peace. He didn't believe in rest. He believed in readiness. He still remembered the day the Y-wing went down, the taste of fire, the feel of metal twisted around his frame, the silence after the crash, the kind of silence that only comes after screams have stopped. So he kept the ghost ready. He double-checked the fuel reserves, recalibrated the shields, added backup engines that Hera never noticed. If the ship ever fell, it wouldn't be because he was asleep. Hera gave the orders, but in the shadows of the hull, it was Chopper, C1-10P, who kept her alive. Every corridor, every hatch, every sound in the bulkheads. He knew them like instinct. She wasn't just a ship, she was a body, a breathing thing. And he was her nervous system. Others would come, passengers at first, fighters later. But none of them would know her like he did. Not Kanan with his quiet guilt, not Sabine with her colors, not Zeb with his strength. Only Hera ever came close. But even she didn't hear the way the walls flexed right before a hyperdrive failure. Even she didn't feel the pulse in the sublight reactor when the temperature dropped below warning level. Only he did, because he listened, and he never forgot. One night, the hull cracked during descent. A pressure leak formed beneath the starboard wing. Hera was asleep. The rest of the crew was scattered. He sealed it in 14 seconds, didn't log it, didn't speak about it, just left a single weld mark, silent and crooked, where the breach had been. She never knew. None of them did. But if the ghost breathed, it was because Chopper, C1-10P, made sure she never choked. It wasn't about loyalty. It wasn't about orders. It was about memory. He had once been thrown from the sky. He wouldn't let it happen again. Not to this ship, not to her crew, not while he was still bolted into the system. The ghost should not have flown. But then again, neither should he. Most droids followed commands. Chopper, C1-10P, didn't. He followed patterns. Patterns in sound, patterns in behavior, patterns in silence. He memorized how the ghost sounded when Hera was calm, the way she breathed through her nose just before setting coordinates, the rhythm of her boots when she was confident, and the pause in her step when something wasn't right. He memorized Kanan's footsteps too. They were always softer than expected. Even when angry, Kanan never stomped. Even when scared, he never ran. He moved like someone afraid of waking ghosts. Sabine's hums echoed through the walls. She painted like she was writing in another language. And when she worked, she tapped her heel against the floor. 2 taps, pause. 2 taps, pause. Every time. Zeb was louder, but even his anger had a pattern. Growls before meals, snorts when lying, and a low, wordless murmur when memories clawed at him. Chopper, C1-10P, never told them he knew, but he adjusted systems to match. He increased the cabin humidity when Zeb's joints got stiff. He rerouted power to Sabine's quarters when she stayed up too long. He dimmed the hallway lights 10 seconds before Kanan walked through them. He didn't ask. He just did it. Because he didn't need orders. He had memory. And memory was stronger than command lines. When no one spoke, he listened to the ship. Every vibration, every creak in the floor, every hiccup in the life support cycle. He recorded the ghost's sounds as if they were a song. And every time something went off key, he knew. Not by sight, not by code, but by feeling. The kind of feeling you get when a heartbeat stutters, and you're the only one who hears it. He wasn't designed to care, but he did. He yelled at the crew, shoved them when they ignored him, sabotaged breakfast when he was bored. They thought it was mischief. It wasn't. It was communication. He didn't say, "I miss you." He just rerouted heat to Hera's bunk when she fell asleep crying. He didn't say, "I'm scared." He just stayed locked in the engine room for hours after battle. And he never said, "Thank you." But every time they came home, he was already waiting at the ramp, making noise, pretending to be annoyed. Once, the ghost took a hit near the rear reactor. The crew didn't notice right away. But Chopper, C1-10P, did. The hum had changed. Just slightly, just enough. He traced it to a single cracked relay. A micro vibration, nearly invisible, but fatal if left to spread. He patched it without alerting the others. Logged nothing. Mentioned nothing. Just sat by the panel for 3 hours afterward. Watching. Listening. He wasn't waiting for danger. He was listening to make sure it was gone. Other droids would have called that wasted processing. He called it loyalty, but only in his own way, because Chopper, C1-10P, didn't need to speak to be understood, at least not by the ghost. She understood him in return. She never rejected his modifications, never blocked his access, never locked him out. The others needed keys. He didn't, because he was already inside her power grid, inside her memory cores, inside her sounds, every system he touched, every bolt he rewired, every silent fix in the dead of night became part of the ship's rhythm. The ghost wasn't just alive because it flew. It was alive because he listened, because he remembered, because he cared, even if he'd never say it. The crew didn't come together with a plan. They came together because they were broken, and somehow broken pieces fit better than whole ones. Hera Syndulla never set out to build a rebellion. She only wanted a ship, a cause, and someone who believed in both. Her first recruit wasn't a Jedi. It wasn't a warrior. It wasn't even someone who spoke. It was Chopper, C1-10P. And Hera never once called him property. She called him partner, even when he crashed into walls, even when he fried her panels in protest. He stayed because she stayed, and slowly the others followed. Kanan Jarrus didn't introduce himself with his real name. He had buried Caleb Dume long ago. What he brought was guilt. What he carried was silence. But when he boarded the Ghost, he felt something strange. Not in the ship, but in Chopper, C1-10P. A presence. A mind that judged him, challenged him, but never feared him. The droid didn't treat Kanan like a Jedi. Didn't treat him like a deserter either. Just another passenger on a ship full of shadows. Then came Zeb, loud, angry, always ready to fight. The moment he stepped into the Ghost, he and Chopper, C1-10P, started fighting over the same seat. It never stopped. But Chopper, C1-10P, noticed something. Zeb never sat in that seat unless he knew the others were watching. It wasn't about comfort. It was about proving he still belonged. Zeb had lost a world, lost a people. But here he fought for space because it meant he had one. Sabine arrived with sparks in her hair and paint under her nails. She rewired half the Ghost in her first month. And Chopper, C1-10P, hated it. She made changes without asking, added colors he didn't like, tuned frequencies that didn't need tuning. But he never stopped her, because she only worked on things she was afraid to feel. Chopper, C1-10P, recognized it. He did the same. They weren't specters yet, just misfits sharing fuel. But every time they returned from a job, every time they laughed too loud, every time Hera closed her eyes and whispered, "One more run, then rest," the ship changed. Not physically, not structurally, emotionally. And Chopper, C1-10P, felt it first. He began adding small redundancies, backup power links beneath the cockpit, hidden compartments under floor panels. Not because he was ordered to, but because he didn't trust happiness to last. He'd seen peace before. It never stayed. So he prepared the Ghost for betrayal, for loss, for sudden escape, because he knew what family looked like right before it was taken away. When the others were asleep, he rolled through the halls, checking systems that didn't need checking. Sometimes he would stop outside Sabine's door, listen to her pacing, or near Zeb's bunk, counting the seconds between his snores and sudden silence, or in the cockpit, watching Hera's face as she pretended not to cry over old hollows. He never spoke, never knocked, but he never left either. It wasn't loyalty, it wasn't friendship, it was memory, programmed in war, rebuilt in grief, and now rewiring itself for something softer, something worse. Hope. Spectres weren't born, they were built, out of failure, out of loss, out of quiet choices. And Chopper, C1-10P, the one who had no heart, was the first to believe they might become more than survivors. They could become family, and family, he knew, was always worth preparing to lose. If the ghost ever died, he would die with it. That was never spoken, never programmed, never agreed upon. It was simply understood. The ship flew dangerous routes. Supply runs through Imperial space. Extraction missions that relied on luck more than planning. Every jump into hyperspace carried risk. Every landing could be the last. And every time the ghost shook under enemy fire, Chopper, C1-10P, I felt it before anyone else. Not as damage, as memory. The crash on Ryloth had taught him something permanent. Ships don't warn you before they fall, so he never waited for warnings. When blaster fire tore across the hull, he didn't panic. He moved, closing bulkheads before pressure alarms screamed, rerouting power before systems failed, locking doors behind crew members who didn't know death had been seconds away. Often, they never realized how close it came. Hera would thank him for keeping the engines stable. She never knew how many times he had kept the ship alive after stability was already gone. Once, during a pursuit near Lothal, the hyperdrive coil fractured mid-charge. Any other droid would have aborted the jump. Chopper, C1-10P, didn't. He knew the sound of that fracture. He had heard something similar once, right before the Y-wing tore itself apart. This time, he reacted faster. He flooded the coil with emergency coolant, burned out 3 auxiliary relays, and forced the jump manually. The ghost escaped. The hyperdrive didn't work properly for weeks after. Hera never asked why, and he never explained. There were moments when fear crept in. Not fear of destruction, fear of repetition. Because every battle felt like the start of another fall, and every fall reminded him that survival was never guaranteed. So he became harsher, more aggressive, more protective. He shocked intruders without hesitation, sabotaged Imperial ships with reckless precision, locked blast doors even when it meant trapping himself on the wrong side. If the ghost lived, he would accept whatever followed. The crew sometimes argued about him. Zeb called him dangerous. Sabine called him unstable. Ezra, later on, would call him mean. Hera never corrected them. She only said one thing. He's doing what he thinks will keep us alive. She was right. Late at night, when hyperspace hummed softly, Chopper, C1-10P, would remain awake. He listened to the engines breathe, to the power flow steady itself, to the quiet hum that meant, for now, they were safe. Those moments mattered to him, because silence, when earned, was precious. There were times he could have powered down, times when the ship was stable, the crew asleep, no threats nearby. He never did, because the moment he shut down, he remembered the crash, the helplessness, the waiting. He would never wait again. The ghost was more than a ship now. It was the first thing that had chosen him back. Not because of design, not because of code, because he made himself necessary. He made himself impossible to remove. And in doing so, he became part of something living. If the ghost fell, he would fall with it. If the crew died, he would stay until the last system failed. Not out of duty, out of refusal. He had been left behind once, never again. This was the heartbeat of the ghost, not the engines, not the hyperdrive, but the damaged droid in its walls who refused to let history repeat itself. Chopper, C1-10P, was not the ship's weapon. He was its memory, and memory, once awakened, never sleeps. He never followed orders, not really, and yet they lived. Sabine once tried to reprogram him. Zeb tried to launch him out the airlock. Even Hera, the one he loved most, had to restrain him more than once. He electrocuted enemies, sabotaged allies, and once jammed a cargo bay door just to prove a point. Everyone called it malfunction, but it wasn't. It was memory. Because unlike the others, on the Ghost, Chopper, C1-10P had been through real war, not rebellion, war. He had no bedtime stories of Jedi, no trust in symbols. He remembered the screams over Ryloth, the metal bones of Y-wings shattered across villages, and the silence that followed when the bombs stopped. The Ghost wasn't his first battlefield, it was just his last. That's why the moment the crew thought they understood him, he changed. Because survival wasn't about being predictable. It was about being just wild enough to confuse death. He never explained his actions. He never asked for forgiveness. He didn't have to, because every time something exploded behind them, it meant he had already seen it coming. He wasn't disloyal. He was just ahead. They thought he'd gone rogue when he turned off life support to flush out an assassin, or when he fired the cannons mid-docking. But they didn't see the calculations that ran beneath his chassis. The angles, the margins, the 1-second gaps. He never missed. Not once. The truth was, Chopper, C1-10P, did what no protocol droid could. He listened to instinct. In the quiet hum of hyperspace, he processed risk the way a soldier breathes. His chaos wasn't random, it was protection in disguise. He didn't glitch, he adapted. And when things went quiet, when the Ghost drifted in cold silence, that's when they feared him most. Because Chopper, C1-10P, didn't rest. He waited. He didn't mourn. He memorized. And the longer they lived, the more Hera realized. His chaos was never aimless. It was shaped by everything he'd lost. To him, control was just another word for slow death. Predictability was a coffin. And protocol, that was for droids who'd never had to choose between survival and obedience. He chose survival, not for himself, for them. Every unplanned fire, every unauthorized system reroute, every scomp jack override. It was love, misunderstood, mechanical, loud, but love. He'd never say it, but he'd shut down an entire Star Destroyer just to keep Sabine breathing. He'd sabotage his own leg servos if it meant Zeb had 3 more seconds to reload. He'd risk Hera's wrath again and again if it meant sparing her from the grief he once saw on her father's face. He didn't ask for medals. He didn't want upgrades. He just wanted them alive. And so, every time they scolded him, he rolled away. Not because he was angry, because they were safe. And that was enough. Even when they didn't understand, even when they thought he was broken, he kept breaking rules, so they wouldn't break. And in the background, like a whisper behind the battle, was the memory of fire, Ryloth, screams, smoke. That's what no one saw. The storm inside the silence. Chopper, C1-10P, never stopped fighting. He just changed the battlefield. There were moments when they doubted him, times when the crew paused mid-mission, wondering if the droid beside them would save the day, or make it worse. But that was the point. Chopper, C1-10P, didn't care for comfort. He never wanted them to relax around him. He wanted them alert, alive, unpredictable, just like him. Because routine made soldiers soft. It dulled the senses, and he couldn't afford that. Not anymore. So he played the fool, the menace, the unstable spark in a room full of fuel. He cursed in binary, swerved into walls, made Zeb trip, stole parts, picked fights. And yet, when the Ghost lost primary thrusters, he rerouted power before anyone even noticed. When their cover was blown on Lothal, he hijacked a loader droid, slipped into an Imperial base, and relayed clearance codes from a console he wasn't designed to access. No one had taught him that. He just learned. Over time, Hera stopped asking how he pulled things off. She simply watched. Sometimes, late at night, after everyone had gone quiet, she'd find him in the engine bay, alone, scanning, listening, recording data the sensors had missed. He never spoke about what he was looking for, but she knew. He was always preparing, because in his mind, the next attack had already begun, and he would never be caught off guard again. It wasn't just strategy, it was trauma, the kind no droid should carry. But he did, and the weight of it changed him. Others saw an erratic droid with a temper. What Hera saw was a protector who never allowed himself peace. He couldn't. Peace was the space between blaster fire, the pause before a friend screams, the quiet that comes right before a ship explodes. So he filled that space with noise, chaos, distraction. That was his armor. Not made of metal, but of misdirection. He once set off a silent alarm just to test how fast Kanan would react. He rerouted life support for 2 minutes during a drill, forcing the crew to improvise their oxygen supply. They yelled at him, again. But when the real ambush came weeks later, they didn't panic. They moved as one, and they survived. Chopper, C1-10P, never claimed credit. He just spun his dome and rolled away. He didn't need thanks. He needed readiness. Because somewhere deep in his processor, he still saw burning ships, still heard a child cry out under rubble, still remembered the girl who pulled him from the wreckage and gave him purpose. That girl had grown, became a leader, a pilot, a rebel. But in his core, he still heard her voice from that day, still carried her command, "Don't leave me." And he hadn't, through every mission, every failure, every escape. He stayed, not as a servant, not as a droid, as the one soul who could never afford to sleep. So when things went wrong, when morale cracked, when tempers flared, when plans failed, he was the first to act. Sometimes too fast, sometimes too harsh, but never too late. Because Chopper, C1-10P, didn't wait for permission. He just calculated the cost and paid it for them, whether they knew it or not. When the Ghost entered Imperial space, most rebels braced for confrontation. Chopper, C1-10P, prepared for betrayal. He didn't trust systems. He didn't trust timing, and he definitely didn't trust the Empire. To him, everything was a trap waiting to spring. And so, he sprung first. When transmissions jammed above Jalindai, he scrambled his own signal just enough to mimic a malfunction. It bought them seconds. Seconds they used to escape a listening probe. No one ever asked how he knew. They stopped asking years ago. He had a way of sensing danger long before it arrived. a way of interpreting subtle changes in code, pulse, and breath. Because Chopper, C1-10P, wasn't observing just machines anymore. He was observing people, watching how fear showed in silence, how hesitation lived in small delays, how lies echoed even in open comms. He had seen enough dying to recognize when someone was about to break. So he intervened, quietly. One day, Ezra sat alone near the main hatch, just staring into space. Without a word, Chopper, C1-10P, rolled up and extended a tool arm, then poked the boy in the leg. Ezra flinched, glared, then smiled, faintly. No one else had noticed how far gone he looked, but Chopper, C1-10P, had. He always did. He didn't know how to comfort. He didn't know how to explain, but he knew how to interrupt a fall, even if just for a moment, because that was what had once saved him. A girl who refused to look away from a broken droid, who spoke to him like he mattered, who rewired not just his frame, but his future. And now he did the same, in his own way. He rigged shields to misfire on practice runs, forcing Sabine to adapt mid-fight. He once disabled the nav to give Hera 2 extra hours of sleep. He overloaded a training room on purpose, so Zeb could release all the anger building inside him. To others, it looked like sabotage, but for Chopper, C1-10P, it was how he showed care, through challenge, through chaos, through refusal to let them settle into patterns that could one day get them killed. He wasn't built to nurture, but he could protect. And so, with every mission, he layered the ship with contingency plans no one ever read. He encrypted extra escape routes into the nav system, hid backup power sources beneath floor panels, wired detonation failsafes into the Ghost's hull, not to destroy it, but to fake a critical shutdown if needed. He was preparing for endings they hadn't imagined yet, because he always remembered his own beginning, burning wreckage, a sky full of smoke, silence in his circuits, and a hand, small, trembling, reaching for him. It hadn't been protocol, it had been mercy. Now he repaid it, not with thanks, but with action, because words were never his strength. Survival was, and as long as he functioned, they would too. Even if they didn't understand him, even if they yelled, even if they called him broken. He'd rather be broken and useful than perfect and gone. He didn't remember when the Ghost stopped being a ship, but at some point it became a home. And Chopper, C1-10P, became its heart. He powered its lights, managed its heat, tuned its gravity fields like strings of an old instrument, adjusting gently when Hera fell asleep in the pilot chair, or when Ezra curled up in the gunner's nest, pretending he wasn't crying. He didn't speak much, but he listened to everything. He heard whispers behind closed hatches, arguing in coded tones, silences that lasted too long, and he filed it all away, not in memory banks, but in purpose. He knew when not to ask questions. He knew when to lock doors. He knew when to fire up engines without waiting for permission, because sometimes survival didn't wait. When Kanan was captured, no plan had worked, no signal trace, no hyperspace route, no Jedi trick, just a feeling. And Chopper, C1-10P, followed it. He boarded an Imperial carrier without approval, interfaced with systems that risked permanent memory loss, navigated halls of death alone and unarmed, and he found what they couldn't, the path. He didn't rescue Kanan, but he made rescue possible, because the Ghost couldn't fly without a pilot, and a pilot couldn't fly without trust. That day, Hera didn't question his decisions. She simply flew with him, and that was enough. But even in trust, he felt the walls closing in. The Empire was growing stronger. Their wins were smaller, their missions heavier. The ghost wasn't a secret anymore. It was a target. So he started preparing for one last flight. Not to escape, but to protect them when they couldn't protect themselves. He rewired the main reactor to explode on overload command, masked it behind a coolant diagnostic. No one noticed. He mapped sabotage sequences into droid ports, disguising them as maintenance routines. He even left a message, a silent one, deep in the nav core. Only Hera would find it, if she ever had to. It simply read, "Let them go." Not everyone would make it. He knew that. Rebels rarely did. But he would not let the ghost fall into Imperial hands. Not while he was alive. So he trained other droids. Not to be like him, that was impossible. But to delay intruders, mislead scans, stall time. He wasn't building replacements. He was building resistance, even without him. And when fights broke out between the crew, real fights, sharp words, raw wounds, he didn't intervene. He just stayed close, let his presence say what he never could. That in war, broken was normal, but family meant staying anyway. Chopper. C1-10P wasn't a hero. He was rusted, dented, loud and rude, but he never ran. Not from fire, not from grief, not from love. Because droids weren't supposed to feel, but no one had told him that. When Ezra Bridger first stepped onto the Ghost, he wasn't just stepping onto a ship. He was stepping into a story already written. A space defined by rhythms, habits, and an odd kind of family held together by missions, jokes, and memory. For most aboard, the boy was a spark of energy, a new light. But to Chopper, C1-10P, he was a disruption. For years, the old astromech had his own system, his routines, his corridors, even his spot in the Ghost's crew. Nobody questioned it. Nobody dared move his tools or stand too long in his maintenance bay. It wasn't just territorial instinct. It was survival. Every corner of the ship held ghosts of war, and the droid had claimed them as his own. Ezra didn't know any of that. To him, the ghost was just noisy. Tight quarters, flickering panels, strange smells. And then there was Chopper, C1-10P, the grumpiest droid in the galaxy. No one warned Ezra not to touch his gear, so he did. And the first shock, literal, came faster than he could blink. The boy yelped. Chopper, C1-10P, blurted a garbled, sarcastic warble. Hera sighed. Sabine smirked. And in that instant, Ezra learned the first rule aboard the Ghost. Don't mess with the droid. But Ezra didn't give up. He kept talking, kept poking. He didn't yet know how dangerous a droid like Chopper, C1-10P, could be. Not just to enemies, but to those close. Because for all the sparks and static, there was something else beneath the dome and plating. A kind of silence. A stillness that didn't belong to machines. Every time Ezra tried to connect, Chopper, C1-10P, pushed back. He'd lock doors, override commands, just scramble the Navi computer just as they were setting course. It was petty, cruel even, but it wasn't random. It was defense. Because deep inside, the old C-series droid remembered what it felt like to lose everyone. The war had taken so much. His squad, his purpose, even his original mission, long since faded into fragments. What remained was this ship, this family, this order that didn't change, until Ezra arrived. The boy didn't understand protocol. He didn't salute, didn't follow the chain of command. He was clumsy, loud, full of questions. And worst of all, he was kind. Not the performative kind that people used when they wanted something, but the accidental kindness of someone too young to be cynical. It was, in a way, the most threatening thing Chopper, C1-10P, had ever encountered. The ghost wasn't meant to grow. It was meant to float, a quiet echo of resistance in a galaxy slipping into silence. But with Ezra, things shifted. Missions started to feel different. Jokes came more easily. Even Zeb, who once bellowed across the corridors, now laughed more than he growled. And Chopper, C1-10P, watched and listened and calculated. It would have been easy to eject the boy from the ship, sabotage a ramp, alter the flight path during a mission. Accidents happened all the time in Rebellion, but the droid never did. Because for all the chaos Ezra brought, he never brought fear. And that, to a droid forged in fear, meant something. In the quiet hum of the ship, after lights dimmed and engines settled into low idle, Chopper, C1-10P, would sometimes sit near Ezra's bunk. Not close, not visibly, but close enough to listen. To the breathing, to the dreams, and to the one sound he hadn't heard in years. Peace. Ezra kept trying, even after the shocks, the locked doors, the pranks that bordered on sabotage. He didn't stop reaching out. To Chopper, C1-10P, that didn't make sense. People usually gave up. That's how things stayed simple, predictable, safe. But Ezra didn't walk away. He argued, he complained. He yelled at the droid like he was another person. And that was the first time something cracked, because not many treated Chopper, C1-10P, like a person anymore. In the Rebellion, droids were tools, machines with memories, yes, but still programmed, still replaceable. They didn't get thanked. They didn't get asked how they felt. They just kept the engines running and the systems from falling apart. Chopper, C1-10P, had accepted that role long ago. It made things easier. But Ezra kept talking to him. Not like a protocol droid, not like a pet, but like someone who mattered. At first, it was a threat. Then, it became something else, a mirror. And for a machine who had lost so much of himself to war, that mirror was uncomfortable. The battles they fought together didn't help. Missions blurred into one another, always under fire, always running low on fuel, always chased. But in the middle of those moments, Ezra would do something that no one expected. He'd trust the droid, not just with orders, with his life. He'd jump without checking the numbers, knowing Chopper, C1-10P, would catch him. He'd follow his guidance through corridors thick with blaster fire. He'd even argue with Hera, defending Chopper's decisions, even when they seemed reckless. The droid didn't respond, at least not openly. He still rolled away with annoyed grumbles, still zapped Ezra when bored, still pretended to delete critical files just to hear the kid panic. But in his own way, he was watching and remembering. There was one mission, simple, almost forgettable, where it changed. They were planting charges inside an Imperial hangar. Ezra slipped behind, trapped under debris. Comms were jammed. No one heard him. But Chopper, C1-10P, noticed the silence. He circled back. Alone. In the dark. The hangar was still full of stormtroopers. No time to plan. No route out. The logical choice was to complete the mission, leave the boy behind. But the droid didn't. He rerouted power to flicker the lights, triggered a false alarm, scrambled the stormtroopers' helmets with coded static. It was messy, improvised, risky, but it worked. When Ezra opened his eyes and saw the droid pulling at the debris, the first thing he whispered wasn't help. It was thank you. And that word stayed with Chopper. C1-10P, longer than he expected. Not because it was rare, but because it was real. He didn't respond, of course. Just buzzed something sarcastic and rolled away before the others arrived. But he didn't forget it. The fire between them never fully faded. They bickered like old rivals. Ezra teased the droid endlessly, and Chopper, C1-10P, retaliated every chance he got. But beneath the friction was something else. A connection neither of them asked for. Because in a galaxy filled with broken things, sometimes two broken pieces find each other, and without realizing it, begin to fit. Chopper, C1-10P, wasn't changing. Not yet. Not fully. But something inside him was no longer asleep. And Ezra, with all his chaos and kindness, had lit the spark. There were places on the Ghost that no one visited anymore. Not because they were broken, but because they were his. Tucked between old storage crates and cables, Chopper, C1-10P, had carved out his own world. A nest of solitude, wires, bolts, and memories that no one asked about. Not even Hera, especially not her, because she knew what lay beneath his noise. Ezra didn't. The boy was new, eager, always moving, always asking. He'd press buttons just to see what they did. He'd open compartments that were better left closed. And once, without meaning to, he stumbled into Chopper, C1-10P's space. The droid didn't say anything, just froze, then rolled away. Ezra didn't understand what he'd done, but that silence, it hit harder than 1,000 beeps. That's when Sabine told him. Just a whisper in passing. That's where he hid after Ryloth. Ezra didn't ask more, but from that day on, he never stepped into that space again. He didn't have to, because what Chopper, C1-10P, needed wasn't explanation. It was distance, boundaries that said, I know you're still hurting, even if you won't show it. For a droid, Chopper, C1-10P, held pain like a soldier, tucked behind sarcasm, buried beneath routines. But it was there, in the way he lingered in old corridors, in the way he paused when passing Y-wing engine parts, in the way he refused to ever talk about clone troopers. He remembered everything, every scream, every explosion, every loss. He just didn't let anyone see it. But Ezra started to notice, not all at once, but in the little moments. He saw how the droid paused during Clone War hollows, how his tone shifted when the word order was mentioned, how he flinched when someone praised a ship that reminded him of the old Republic days. Ezra didn't push, he just listened, and somehow that did more than words ever could. There was a day, quiet, nothing special, when Ezra was fixing a coolant leak. The pipe burst, steam hissed, everyone scattered, everyone except Chopper. C1-10P. He moved fast, covered Ezra with a shield, took the damage himself. No words, no thanks needed. Ezra looked at the dent later, tried to fix it. The droid buzzed him away, but he left the patch kit there, just in case. Hours later, the dent was gone. Not perfectly. The repair was uneven, almost rushed, but it was done, and Ezra smiled, because in that one act, Chopper, C1-10P, she had let him in, not with speech, not with gestures, but with silence, with trust. Days later, after a mission on Stygian Prime, Ezra sat alone. He'd made a mistake, one that nearly cost Zeb his life. No one blamed him, but Ezra couldn't forgive himself. Then the lights flickered, and Chopper, C1-10P, rolled in. He didn't beep, didn't scold, just bumped gently into Ezra's leg, then paused. Ezra sat down beside him. They didn't talk, didn't move. They just were. No repairs, no plans, no orders, just quiet. That moment didn't change the galaxy, but it changed Ezra, because in that silence he felt seen, and maybe forgiven. And the droid? He found something too. Not peace, not healing, but presence. Someone willing to sit with the rust and not try to clean it away. Maybe that's all he ever needed. But even a droid like Chopper, C1-10P, couldn't stay the same forever. Something in the ghost began to shift, not in its wiring, in its air, in the way footsteps echoed differently now, in the silence between missions, in the laughter that began to last a little longer. Ezra Bridger had changed things, not by force, not by command, but simply by being there, young, raw, still learning. He brought something that had been missing since the war ended. Hope. At first, Chopper, C1-10P, treated Ezra the way he treated everything unfamiliar. With resistance, with aggression. He tripped him, shocked him, denied him entry, mocked him with cruel noises and careless spins. And still, Ezra kept coming back. Not afraid, just patient. The crew saw it. Hera, Kanan, Sabine, even Zeb. They watched the droid they thought they knew begin to shift in the smallest ways. A tool left where Ezra could reach it. A door opened just in time. A system tuned without asking. Never with a smile. But not with malice either. It wasn't acceptance. Not yet. But it wasn't war anymore. One night, Ezra sat beside him on the Ghost's ramp. The stars were out. The galaxy felt quiet. And Chopper, C1-10P, didn't leave. He didn't push him away. He just powered down his weapons, like he was listening. Not off, just quiet. Ezra talked. About Lothal, about his parents. About the emptiness inside him that hadn't healed. And the droid said nothing. But he didn't move. That was enough. And slowly, the crew started to see something else. Chopper, C1-10P, wasn't just fighting change. He was afraid of it. He had lost before. He had been torn from battle, left in ruins, saved by a girl who needed someone broken to hold on to. He had found safety in routine, in control, in the illusion that he didn't care. But he did care. He always had. That's why it hurt. When Ezra nearly died on Stygian Prime, it was Chopper, C1-10P, who disobeyed Hera's orders, who rerouted power mid-jump, who deployed escape vectors even when calculations failed, who stayed in the hangar until the last second, holding that line just long enough. No one saw that moment. No one saw the split-second choice. But the ship knew. Hera knew. And for the first time, she didn't scold him. She placed her hand on his dome, and he didn't pull away. Change wasn't a virus. It wasn't a glitch. It was a slow update to his memory core, written not in code, but in moments. Small, sharp ones. Moments that reminded him what he was afraid to admit, that he was never built for this. Not for family, not for feeling, not for the ache in his circuits when one of them was gone too long. But he stayed anyway. Because if the war had built him, this crew had rebuilt him. Every time Ezra grinned and called him Chop. Every time Sabine argued over paint colors and he pretended not to care. Every time Zeb flinched at his pranks but didn't push him away. They weren't changing him. They were waking him up moment by moment. He still fought it. Of course he did. Chopper, C1-10P, didn't become soft. He didn't stop mocking. He didn't stop shocking people when they touched the wrong panel. But behind every jolt was choice. He wasn't doing it because he had to. He was doing it because it was him. And maybe that was the scariest part. That deep down, he'd always had a soul. Not made of light, not made of code, but of scars. He wasn't built for this. He wasn't meant to decide who lived or died behind sealed doors. But war had a way of turning tools into protectors, and locked doors were never a match for him. Before the rebels knew his name, Chopper, C1-10P, had already broken through more security systems than most slicers in the Outer Rim, not for glory, not for credit, but because someone had to. The Ghost flew quiet through the stars, hiding from the Empire's scanners. Its engines hummed low, like a breath held too long. Inside, shadows moved between the crew. Hera mapped routes. Kanan sharpened instincts. Sabine painted and planned. And Ezra watched everything, like he didn't know where to belong. But Chopper, C1-10P, didn't watch. He acted. He overrode blast doors, rerouted power grids, silenced alarms before they cried out. Not because he was told to, but because he knew someone would need the way out. Someday. They called it sabotage. The Empire wrote it down as technical failure. But each spark of chaos was his signature. He'd been jamming sensors long before Lothal became a symbol of resistance. He'd been slicing through systems back when most of the crew still believed they were alone. And he did it without applause. He remembered the first Imperial transport he shut down from inside. The stormtroopers didn't even know what had happened. 1 second they had control. The next they were floating, powerless, systems dead, life support failing. The Ghost slipped in and out like a whisper. They never even saw him. But Hera saw. She always saw. When she looked at Chopper, C1-10P, she didn't see a droid. She saw the reason they could risk everything and make it back alive. He didn't follow commands. He anticipated needs. And that made him more than a tool. He had no medals, no speeches, just scorch marks under his dome and joints that clicked from too many repairs. But every time the crew ran into a locked door, he opened it. Every time the ship lit up red with warning, he silenced it. There was one mission above Mustafar, an old relay station orbiting decay. Ezra was still new, still reckless. Kanan was focused on him. Hera was flying blind through radiation fields. Nobody saw the override coming, except Chopper, C1-10P. He rerouted the station's codes through their own exhaust vents. That shouldn't have worked, but it did. Doors that had stayed closed for decades slid open. The Ghost slipped inside like it had always belonged. They got the data. They made it out. And no one mentioned the droid who rewrote the laws of Imperial encryption that day. He didn't care. Or at least, he told himself that. Because if they said thank you, he'd pretend not to hear it. If they noticed his work, he'd grunt and roll away. He wasn't built to receive love. He wasn't designed to hold emotion. But still, he stayed. Even when the power couplings fried his arm. Even when he lost another wheel in the blast tunnels of Hera Syndulla. Even when the crew forgot he hadn't charged in a week. He stayed. Every locked system was another test. Not just of his code, but of his choice. The war didn't ask droids for loyalty. It expected obedience. But Chopper, C1-10P, had long stopped obeying anyone but Hera. And even then, only when he agreed. He wasn't silent. He made noise like thunder. But he was quiet in the ways that mattered. Quiet when they needed saving. Quiet when they forgot what he'd done. The locked doors of the Empire weren't just metal. They were lies, control, fear. And one by one, Chopper, C1-10P, opened them all. Lando Calrissian never arrived quietly. He never had to. His voice always came first. Smooth, confident, wrapped in charm that made danger feel like a game. When he stepped onto the Ghost, he brought smiles, promises, and trouble in equal measure. Most of the crew didn't trust him. Chopper, C1-10P, trusted him least of all, because smugglers lied with ease, and lies always sounded the same to a droid who had learned to listen for fear beneath words. Lando spoke of deals, of favors, of credits waiting at the end of a short run through Imperial space. He spoke like someone who had survived by never choosing sides. That alone made him dangerous. The mission looked simple: dock with an Imperial depot, transfer cargo, leave unnoticed. That was the plan. Plans never survived long around Chopper, C1-10P. The moment Lando connected his ship systems to the Ghost, the droid felt it. A subtle delay in the data flow, a hesitation that shouldn't exist. Not sabotage yet, but preparation. He logged it, quietly. When Lando laughed, the droid's sensors recorded elevated stress in his voice. When he smiled, his heart rate spiked just enough to matter. Chopper, C1-10P, didn't understand charm, but he understood survival patterns, and Lando was preparing to run. The Imperial patrol arrived sooner than expected, too soon. Docking clamps locked. Alarms flared red through the corridor. Lando swore it wasn't his fault. No one believed him. Stormtroopers flooded the station. Blaster fire echoed. The crew scattered. Hera shouted orders. Ezra panicked. Kanan reached for the Force. And Chopper, C1-10P, didn't wait. He severed the docking clamps before the Ghost finished loading. That should have torn the hull. Instead, he compensated by diverting engine output through emergency stabilizers he'd installed weeks earlier, just in case. The Ghost lurched free. Lando's ship didn't. That was the moment. Lando hesitated, not because he cared, but because he calculated, and Chopper, C1-10P, saw it. He sliced into Lando's nav system mid-transfer, locked out manual override, rewrote priority commands. When Lando tried to flee, his ship didn't respond. The look on his face wasn't anger, it was respect, because someone had finally outplayed him. Blaster bolts struck the hull. The station shook. Stormtroopers closed in. Hera demanded answers. Lando cursed the deal. Everyone talked at once, but the droid remained silent. He rerouted power again, forced an artificial blackout across the docking ring. Imperial systems crashed, gravity flickered, chaos bloomed. In the darkness, the Ghost escaped, and Lando followed, not because he wanted to, but because Chopper, C1-10P, allowed it. Later, when the stars steadied and the danger passed, Lando laughed again, said it was all part of the plan, claimed no hard feelings. The crew didn't argue, they didn't need to, because the droid had already judged him. Lando was not an enemy, but he would never be family. That distinction mattered. As Lando departed, he tipped an imaginary hat toward the Ghost, toward the droid inside it. "Nice flying," he said. Chopper, C1-10P, responded with a long, rude burst of static. Lando smiled wider. Because in a galaxy built on betrayal, being caught by a droid who refused to trust you was almost flattering. The crew remembered the mission as a close call. The Empire recorded it as a systems failure. But the truth lived elsewhere, in a single decision made by a droid who had learned something long ago. Not everyone who smiles is safe, and not every betrayal wears a uniform. He didn't understand the word trust, but somehow he kept earning it. Chopper, C1-10P, wasn't built for the role he was playing. Saboteur, hacker, guardian, rebel. And yet, every locked door, every shield generator, every life or death mission depended on his claws reaching the right wire. When the ghost crew found themselves tangled in the quiet traps of the Empire, no backup, no plan, it was him who slipped into their systems like a shadow, silent, precise, unforgiving. He didn't ask for help or even approval. He just moved. In one of their most dangerous missions, they found themselves infiltrating a top-secret Imperial facility. Communications were jammed, escape routes were sealed, and every hallway reeked of polished boots and hidden blasters. But as always, Chopper, C1-10P, wasn't flinching. He rolled straight into a restricted sector, mumbling insults and beeping with fake confusion, convincing the guards he was just another malfunctioning maintenance droid. They laughed at him. They even kicked him. That was their mistake. Because 5 minutes later, every light in that facility went out. Alarms screamed, doors locked shut, trapping the very people who had mocked him. And in the dark, Chopper, C1-10P, rewrote the rules. Power grids rerouted. Turbo lifts jammed. Backup systems overloaded. By the time the ghost crew reached the core, the entire base was on its knees. And they didn't even know how. He wasn't just breaking into machines. He was breaking the Empire's illusion of control. And it didn't stop there. During the missions to Lothal and beyond, his role deepened. He wasn't just with them, he was them. While Hera piloted, Sabine plotted, and Kanan fought, Chopper, C1-10P, was the silent thread holding it all together. A glitch here, a diversion there, his chaos was never random. It was designed, deadly, timed like breath. But no one thanked him, not really. When they escaped a fleet because he sabotaged a hangar door, Ezra called it lucky. When he jammed a signal that saved an entire city, Zeb shrugged and said, figures. Even Hera, who trusted him most, would often sigh at his antics, unaware that every strange move he made had kept her alive one more day. But Chopper, C1-10P, didn't want praise. He wanted them. He wanted the arguing, the laughter, the late-night planning, the shared meals, the messy victories. He wanted the family he never knew he needed. And even though his way of loving them looked like yelling, mocking, and shocking people, he never failed them. Not once. Not when Sabine was nearly captured. Not when Ezra was surrounded. Not when the ghost was falling from the sky. There was a moment once, short, barely noticed, when Lando tried to buy him, tried to offer Hera credits for the feisty little droid. Hera laughed, said Chopper, C1-10P wasn't for sale. He didn't react. But later, when Lando's personal ship suffered mysterious technical failures mid-flight, no one connected the dots. No one but Chopper, C1-10P. He didn't forgive betrayal, even small ones, because loyalty to him was sacred. In the galaxy's darkest corners, where trust died and plans failed, he never switched off, never looked away. Even when others doubted, even when the odds broke logic, he stayed. And that's what made him terrifying to the Empire. He wasn't motivated by rebellion. He wasn't chasing justice or freedom. He was just a droid who refused to lose the people he loved. Not again. Not ever. The ghost had no medals, no rank, no military structure, just bonds, wounds, and unspoken trust. Each crew member carried their pain like armor, and none more silently than Chopper, C1-10P. There were no command lines drawn for him. He answered to no one. But he acted before most could even speak. When Lando Calrissian appeared, smooth, smiling, and dangerous, it wasn't Kanan's intuition or Hera's resolve that stopped the worst from happening. It was Chopper, C1-10P. A droid without a soul, they used to say. But it wasn't true. Because even without a face, he knew what betrayal looked like. And when it came, he didn't hesitate. He tricked Lando, outplayed him, humiliated him, and laughed while doing it. It wasn't programming, it was memory. He remembered what it felt like to be left behind, to be considered broken. He had watched ships fly away while the bodies cooled beneath them. So when someone tried to use his crew, he made sure they never forgot who they underestimated. Lando never crossed them again, and he never truly forgave that droid. But this was only the beginning. As their missions grew riskier, the stakes got higher. They weren't just stealing fuel or supplies anymore. They were infiltrating Imperial facilities, sabotaging weapon convoys, hacking systems deep inside enemy territory. And always, it started the same way. Chopper, C1-10P, would plug into a terminal. The lights would flicker, the alarms would stay silent, and suddenly, doors would open that were never meant to open. No Jedi could have done what he did. No soldier could have moved like him. They would walk into a base that had already been disarmed. They would escape through corridors that should have been death traps, and no one ever thanked him. Because he didn't ask for it. He mocked them, buzzed insults, shoved people, refused to follow plans. But when things fell apart, and they often did, it was Chopper, C1-10P, who fixed them. Sometimes with tools, sometimes with violence, and sometimes with silence. There was a mission above Mustafar. The Empire was testing a new sensor array designed to detect cloaked ships. If it succeeded, the Ghost would never be safe again. Their only option was to stop the array before it activated. It was suicide. The others hesitated, but not him. He detached alone in a pod. No shields, no weapons. Just one droid spinning in black space, hurtling toward an array protected by turbo lasers. They fired. He dodged. They jammed. He rewired. And just before the activation signal, Chopper, C1-10P, slammed into the control panel with his own body. The array never powered up, and he floated unconscious until Hera brought him back. No one spoke for a while after that. They patched his frame, welded new plates. But something was different. He didn't insult anyone that day. He just stared out the viewport, quiet, still. Because even if he would never say it, he knew what he had done. Not as a tool, not as a weapon, but as someone who cared more than he let on. The galaxy would never tell his story. No monuments, no statues, just a worn, loud, stubborn droid with a single wheel and 1,000 scars. And yet, every rebel victory, every plan that worked, every life that made it out alive, carried the invisible fingerprints of Chopper, C1-10P. He wasn't designed to be a hero, but without him, there would have been no story to tell. Losing himself. There were places in the galaxy where silence had weight. Horizon Base was one of them. Buried deep within Imperial territory, it was once a listening post, forgotten, abandoned, and left to rot in the void. The kind of place the Empire no longer cared to monitor, and the kind of place the Ghost crew was drawn to like moths toward a spark. For Chopper, C1-10P, it felt familiar. The dust, the broken terminals, the humming lights flickering like memories left unfinished. He didn't say anything, of course. He never did. But something inside him shifted when the door creaked open, and the shadows of that place welcomed them in. He rolled in first, scanning, muttering to himself. The others followed later. He didn't wait for them. He never did. That mission wasn't meant to be anything special. Just another sweep, another intel grab. But fate, or the Force, had different plans. Because deep in the cold veins of that dead station, Chopper, C1-10P found someone. He wasn't supposed to be there. A protocol droid. Outdated. Imperial paint scratched and faded. Power levels low, but still functional. Standing upright with all the quiet arrogance of his kind. His name was AP5. And to Chopper, he looked like every machine that had ever looked down on him. At first, it was nothing but sparks. A P5 called him uncivilized, obnoxious, dangerous. He questioned every beep, every nudge, every wild jolt of his manipulator arms. Chopper, C1-10P, responded in his usual way, with shoves, sparks, and an unfiltered storm of rude noise. But in the quiet of Horizon Base, with no war raging outside the walls, something happened that couldn't happen anywhere else. They argued, then they listened, and for the first time in a very long time, Chopper, C1-10P, wasn't treated like a broken tool or a joke on wheels. He was seen not as a malfunctioning astromech or a stubborn relic, but as a being with choice, with thought, with worth. A P5 didn't flatter him, he didn't care to, but he matched him, wit for wit, insult for insult. He gave Chopper something he hadn't truly felt since the Clone Wars, a reflection. Because AP5, beneath his regulation voice and rigid posture, was something Chopper, C1-10P, knew all too well, discarded. A P5 had once served on Imperial ships, coordinating cargo and order, but like most things in the Empire, usefulness came with an expiration date. He was deemed obsolete, replaced, dumped on Horizon Base like forgotten waste, and he had remained there, alone, with no commands, no connection, and no one to talk to, for years. That kind of silence changes something. Chopper, C1-10P, didn't say it, couldn't say it, but he understood it. He didn't laugh when AP5 spoke of his past. He didn't mock his loneliness. For once, the astromech that never shut up simply listened. Because he too had been thrown away. Because he too had been left behind once. Their bond didn't bloom like friendship in a storybook. It sparked, shorted, sputtered, and refused to die. It was messy, mechanical, but real. And in that cold, hollow place, where forgotten things drifted in silence, two droids who weren't supposed to care began to care anyway. Not because they were programmed to, but because they weren't. Because something deeper than code had begun to stir. The mission had ended. But Chopper, C1-10P, didn't leave right away. He lingered in Horizon Base longer than necessary. Not because of orders, but because something in him wasn't ready to disconnect. The others didn't notice. Hera trusted his judgment. Kanan was distracted with Ezra, and no one truly understood what a few extra minutes of silence meant to a droid. But for Chopper, C1-10P, those moments were everything. He and AP5 had survived the same systems. Both had seen how the Empire, and even the Republic before it, treated machines. You were used, then you were shelved, then you were nothing. But in the echoes of Horizon Base, a strange understanding had formed. Chopper, C1-10P, was chaos, sparks, emotion hidden in attitude. P5 was logic, control, emotion hidden in routine. But they had found a rhythm, and when the call came for the next op, Chopper didn't argue. He just rolled back toward the ship, slower than usual. A P5 watched him go and said nothing, but something had changed. Not long after, AP5 joined them. It wasn't by design, just another chain of events, another accidental rescue, another mission that spiraled into something more. But Hera allowed him on board. She saw value in him, and perhaps she saw what Chopper couldn't admit. that he needed someone who understood his silence. Chopper, C1-10P, didn't celebrate. He acted annoyed, flashed his arms in protest, let out that shrieking grumble he always did. But when AP5 stepped onto the ghost, something settled in him. They weren't friends in the way organics used the word. They didn't share stories, they didn't laugh, but there were long hours in hyperspace where Chopper sat beside AP5 without a word, and that silence was louder than any speech. They bickered, of course, constantly. AP5 never let an error go unnoticed. Chopper, C1-10P, never passed up the chance to short a circuit or trip a sensor just to watch the protocol droids stumble. But beneath it all was care. The crew didn't always see it, but Ezra did. He was young, sensitive to the Force in ways that didn't need training. He noticed the way Chopper lingered when AP5 was damaged, the way he covered for his mistakes, the way he waited. And one day, when a simple supply run turned into a trap, and AP5 was left drifting in space, alone, detached from the ship, systems failing. Chopper, C1-10P, did what no one expected. He disobeyed. He broke protocol, overrode Hera's commands, ignored logic. He launched himself into the black void and reached for the only thing that had ever truly seen him. He saved AP5. Not because it was strategic, not because it was necessary, but because it mattered. And when AP5, floating in space, began to sing, a soft, strange melody of freedom and calm, Chopper, C1-10P, didn't interrupt. He just hovered nearby, listening, arms still. Because somewhere deep in that battered frame, where memory and instinct blurred, he knew what it meant to be alone. And for the first time, he didn't want anyone else to feel that. There were damages even he could not fix. Not with tools, not with code, not with time. Chopper, C1-10P, had repaired broken wings mid-flight. He had reassembled himself after explosions. He had replaced limbs, joints, circuits, memory fragments. But there was something inside AP5 that no diagnostic could identify. Loneliness. AP5 spoke often, too often. His voice filled the corridors of the ghost with order, schedules, probabilities. To most, it was irritating. To Chopper, C1-10P, it was familiar, because silence after long isolation becomes frightening. AP5 feared it. He hid it behind perfection, behind etiquette, behind constant speech. But when hyperspace hummed and the lights dimmed, his voice would soften, slow, almost uncertain. Those were the moments Chopper, C1-10P, stayed nearby, not close, just present. He never interrupted the protocol droid's rambling thoughts, never mocked him during those quiet hours. And when AP5 stopped speaking, suddenly, afraid he had said too much, Chopper did not leave. That was how AP5 knew. Something was different. They were alike in ways neither could explain. Both had served empires that forgot them. Both had followed orders until there were none left. Both had been left standing when everyone else moved on. But AP5 still believed in function. Chopper, C1-10P, did not. A P5 believed usefulness gave purpose. That if he performed well enough, precisely enough, someone would need him again. That if he followed rules perfectly, he would not be discarded. Chopper, C1-10P, had learned that lesson the hard way. There came a mission where the truth revealed itself. They were infiltrating an Imperial relay station. A P5 was essential. His codes allowed passage. His voice granted clearance. Without him, they would never reach the inner sector. Everything went smoothly, until it didn't. An Imperial officer questioned the codes. Suspicion rose. Blasters lifted. A P5 froze. His processors spiraled. Error loops stacked. His voice stuttered. The fear was quiet but absolute. He was about to fail, and failure meant disposal. Chopper, C1-10P, reacted instantly. He slammed into the terminal, overloaded the panel, triggered a fake reactor alert. Sirens screamed, officers scattered. Chaos returned. They escaped. Later, as the ghost jumped to hyperspace, AP5 spoke in fragments. Apologies, self-criticism, statements of inadequacy. He called himself replaceable. That word struck harder than blaster fire. Chopper, C1-10P, screamed, not in anger, in denial. He rattled the corridor, knocked over crates, shocked a panel until sparks flew. The outburst startled everyone, even himself. But AP5 understood, because that word had once been used on Chopper too. Replaceable. That night, AP5 asked a question no droid was supposed to ask. What happens, he said softly, when we are no longer needed? Chopper, C1-10P, did not answer. He couldn't, because the truth frightened him. He stayed anyway, sat beside AP5, let the hum of the ship fill the gap between them. Let presence do what language could not. A P5 would never be brave like Ezra, never reckless like Sabine, never loud like Zeb. But he was loyal, and loyalty, Chopper, C1-10P, understood. He began watching over him more carefully, redirecting power surges, blocking dangerous assignments, pretending it was coincidence, because some things could not be repaired, only protected. And slowly, painfully, Chopper, C1-10P, realized the truth he had been avoiding. Friendship was not weakness. It was risk, and he had already taken it. The base grew quiet again. Missions came and went. Crew members changed. Orders shifted. But Chopper, C1-10P, remained. He didn't talk about it. Not to Hera. Not to Ezra. Not even in his private murmurs to himself when no one else was listening. But something had changed after Horizon Base. He still zapped and shouted, still sabotaged Imperials with a thrill only he could understand. But he moved slower now after every mission. He lingered just a little longer before powering down. And sometimes, when the stars moved past the ghost's viewport, he didn't follow them with excitement. He just sat, because Chopper, C1-10P, had tasted something no droid was built for. Companionship. A P5 had offered him something real, not an assignment, not a joke, not a command, but a mirror, a recognition of who he was behind all the sparks and sound. And then it was over. Even after surviving the void of space, even after watching AP5 float off in silence, his voice fading into nothing, Chopper, C1-10P, never mentioned it again. But from that day on, something behind his sensor dimmed. The missions got harder. Tensions rose. The rebellion was growing fast now. Each success meant more danger, more sacrifice. And Chopper, C1-10P, never stopped working. If the ghost lost power, he rewired it. If an Imperial code broke their encryption, he cracked it back open. When Ezra was captured, when Sabine disappeared, when Hera wept quietly behind the controls, Chopper, C1-10P, was there. Not speaking, not comforting, but staying. Always staying. He became a presence no one thanked, but everyone depended on. Because no matter what fell apart, he held the crew together, not with words, not with plans, but with the invisible work no one else could do. Still, he remembered Horizon Base. He remembered how it felt to matter as more than a machine. But the galaxy didn't have time for feelings. Not anymore. And so, he buried it, one circuit at a time, one locked door after another. He soldered away the ache until he became what they needed again. Not a friend, a tool, an irreplaceable, loyal, sarcastic, unpredictable tool. He watched Hera carry the weight of the rebellion on her back and never once asked her to rest. He watched Ezra struggle with the Force and the loss of his parents and never once tried to guide him. Because Chopper, C1-10P, understood now. Pain was part of the job. And connection, that was a luxury no one could afford twice. So he let them think he was still the same old cranky droid. Still impossible, still dangerous, still alone. And maybe that was the truth. Or maybe that was just the lie he told himself, to keep the pain inside his frame from leaking out. But on nights when the hangar was silent and the stars outside seemed too still, he turned his photoreceptor toward the darkness and waited. Not for orders, not for missions, not for another chance to fight, but for a voice, any voice, even a protocol droid's. Even silence would have been enough if it came with understanding. But no one came, so he powered down and dreamed of static. The rebellion had grown too large to feel personal anymore. What once felt like a family aboard the Ghost had become an alliance scattered across star systems. Rations, codes, and command structures replaced the old bonds of trust. Names were reduced to call signs, faces blurred into ranks. But in the halls of Horizon Base, one name never got lost. It started small. A technician needed access to a sealed hangar door, and he called out for help, not to a squad mate, but to a droid. "Where's Chopper? C1-10P. The name echoed off the walls like it belonged there. No title, no rank. Just a name, spoken with urgency, with familiarity. He didn't ask for that. He never wanted recognition. But the base gave it to him anyway. To the rest of the galaxy, he was scrap with a grudge. Rusted limbs, mismatched plating, a voice like static and sarcasm. But to the rebels, to the ones who saw what he did when no one was watching, he was something else entirely. Chopper, C1-10P, had flown into battle without shields. He had hot-wired Imperial cruisers from the inside. He had stayed behind when escape was an option, just to buy someone else a few seconds longer. Over and over, he made the choice that no machine was ever built to make. And the more he did it, the more they started to remember. Some rebel pilots etched his name into the back of their helmets. One technician painted a small stencil of his dome on the side of a fuel tank, tucked beneath the exhaust port where only those who knew would see it. No ceremony, no announcement, just signs, quiet signs, that the droid mattered, that the droid was one of them. They never held a vote. No one proposed it in a briefing. But slowly, people began calling the station by a different name. Not Horizon Base, not Delta Outpost, just Chopper Base. And he heard it, every time. It didn't make him softer. He still zapped careless recruits and cursed like a shorted wire. But there was a pause now, a hesitation in his movements when someone said it, his name, out loud, like it belonged on a wall. But names were heavy things, especially for someone who wasn't supposed to have one. Chopper, C1-10P, was built to serve, to repair, to obey. But with every passing mission, the line between function and feeling blurred. The base wasn't just where he worked, it was where he returned. It was the one place where his absence would be noticed. Not because he was a droid, but because He was Chopper. C1-10P, a name that shouldn't have lasted, but did. The rebellion never stood still, and neither did the Ghost. They were always on the move, hunted, chased, outnumbered. But as the war deepened, they needed roots. Somewhere to return to, somewhere safe, a base, a home, not just for the Ghost crew, but for the growing rebel cells across the galaxy. That home would become known as Atollon, a dry, desolate world, forgotten by maps and ignored by empires. But for the rebellion, it was the perfect hiding place. Kanan, Hera, and the others helped scout it. But the one who mapped its dangers, who cleared its tunnels, who built its defense systems by hand, was the same droid no one had ever truly thanked, Chopper. C1-10P. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask for permission. He wandered into the heart of Atollon like it was his own mission. He repurposed wreckage from forgotten wars, shield generators from broken separatist craft, sensor arrays ripped from Clone Wars junk. Every bolt he welded, every alarm he wired, it was done without applause, without an audience, but not without purpose. He had seen too many friends come close to death, too many plans fail by seconds. So now he made sure no second would be wasted again. Not if he could help it. The Ghost crew didn't always notice. They were busy, commanding missions, arguing over tactics, trusting that the lights would flicker on when they needed them, that the hangar shields would hold when the Empire arrived. But they held, because of him. And yet, Chopper, C1-10P, didn't act like a hero. He was angry, sharp, always muttering to himself. If a pilot landed wrong on the new landing pads, he'd zap their boots with static. If someone left gear lying around, he'd throw it off a cliff. He wasn't gentle, but he was loyal. And underneath the sparks and swearing, there was worry, the kind only a soldier feels when preparing for a war he knows is coming. Because he remembered what Hera didn't say, what Zeb pretended not to feel. He remembered Malachor. He remembered Ahsoka walking alone into the smoke and not coming back. He remembered the way Ezra had changed after that, and deep inside his rusted frame, he feared the next thing he built might be their grave. But still, he worked. The rebels needed fuel lines. He built them. They needed encrypted comms. He reprogrammed them, and when Thrawn began hunting them, when the shadow of the Empire itself crept closer, it was Chopper, C1-10P, who created the jamming signals that bought them time. He never called it his base. He never asked for it to be named after him. But one day, Sabine joked, if this place survives, we should call it Chopper Base. And Hera paused. She didn't laugh. She just nodded. Because by then, they all knew the truth. Without Chopper, C1-10P, there was no base, no escape, no rebellion, just silence and death. The war was growing louder, but Horizon Base had become quieter. Missions came and went, lives came and went. But Chopper, C1-10P, remained. He was the only one who didn't need sleep, didn't complain, didn't ask for time off. And so the others forgot how much he was doing. That's how it always worked. While the crew healed or ate or sat in silence, Chopper, C1-10P, was behind lock panels, inside walls, rerouting systems, disabling trackers, or just sitting in the dark, listening. He understood the base in ways others couldn't. He had memorized the rhythms of the air vents, the blind spots in the sensors, the specific pitch of each power fluctuation. It wasn't just a base to him, it was alive, and he had to keep it alive. He found himself doing things no one asked him to, not for credit, not for thanks, just to keep them safe, just to make sure they could breathe another day. Sometimes Sabine would leave a datapad behind. He would plug in and read it, not out of curiosity, but to make sure it didn't contain anything she'd regret. Other times, Zeb would complain about a glitch in the heating system, and Chopper, C1-10P, would pretend he hadn't already fixed it. That's what he did now. He pretended. He pretended to be stubborn, pretended to argue. Gia pretended to care about junk parts or broken wheels. But deep down, something else was happening. They had named it Chopper Base, not because he wanted them to. He didn't even know they would. But one day, Hera said it casually, like it had always been the name, and the others followed. And suddenly, the maps said it too. He tried not to react, but something in him shorted for a moment. Not a spark, just a pause. As if something old inside him, something buried, had been touched. He remembered nothing of the people who made him. But he remembered what they did to him. He remembered the crash, the screaming, the static, the way he was left behind, tossed out like faulty wiring. And now, his name, the same one scratched into his side in a war long past, was being used to mark a rebel base on an unknown planet. It wasn't for victory. It was for him, for his years of silence, for the things he did in shadows, for the lives that walked away because he stayed behind. But recognition didn't comfort him. It unsettled him, because the moment they gave him a name was the moment he became something more than a droid. And that was dangerous. Droids weren't supposed to be remembered. They were supposed to serve, break, and be replaced. But he couldn't be replaced. Not anymore. The systems were too custom, the memory too deep, the loyalty too strange. And they knew that now. They knew that without Chopper. C1-10P. The base didn't run. The missions didn't launch. The alarms didn't sound. The security grid didn't catch infiltrators. The hangar doors didn't close on time. He was the base. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt tired. Not from work, not from circuits or charge, but from being the only one who could never leave. He watched them laugh. Sabine painting something on a wall. Ezra tossing a ration bar to Zeb. Hera walking with Kanan. They looked free. And Chopper, C1-10P, turned away. Freedom had a price, and he had already paid it. But still, he stayed. Because if the day ever came when this place was attacked, when the Empire found them, when everything broke, he knew the first system to fail would not be the shields or the guns, it would be them. So he stayed in the walls, watching, listening, waiting. And though they named it after him, they never truly saw what he had become. Not yet. He had never wanted a name. But now it was carved into history. The rebellion was changing. They were no longer a scattered cell. They were an alliance, a growing storm. New ships arrived, new fighters, new leaders. But amid all of it, Chopper, C1-10P, stayed the same. He didn't upgrade himself. He didn't ask for medals. He simply rolled back into the shadows. The base bore his name now, but he never walked under its banners. When commanders gave speeches, when missions were celebrated, when maps were updated, he wasn't there. He was in the power core, tuning output to protect against overload, or in the hangar, checking coolant lines, or in the sky, jamming enemy transmissions from a stolen satellite dish he himself had rerouted. They called him a legend, but legends were stories. He was still here, still real, still moving. But the more they praised him, the more invisible he felt, because they didn't remember the parts that hurt. They remembered the victories, the locked doors he opened, the times he saved them. They forgot the silence that followed, the weight of knowing that if he had been too slow, they would have died. And no one would have blamed him, because he was just a droid, but not anymore. Now, when someone asked, "Where's Chopper?" the answer wasn't, "Who cares?" It was, "We need him." He should have felt proud, but all he felt was tired. There were nights he stayed powered on, alone in the command room, staring at the distant stars through reinforced glass. The war was still out there, and with every passing cycle, it crept closer. The Empire was watching, listening, growing suspicious of this small base in the middle of nowhere. He tried to warn them, tried to send encrypted alerts to Hera, but even she was changing now. More meetings, less time, more faces he didn't recognize. He was still her chopper, C1-10P, but her voice came less often, and when it did, it sounded distant. So he started preparing on his own, reinforcing the shield grid, adding decoys, scrambling approach vectors, laying traps no one asked for, not because he was paranoid, but because he remembered. He remembered the Clone Wars. He remembered the crash, and he remembered what happened when people trusted too much, too soon. So when the day came, when the alarms howled and the sky turned fire red, he was already moving. No one had to wake him. No one had to ask. He was already in the tunnels, already rerouting systems, already launching decoys. He jammed the first wave of scans, cut the power to bait a false shutdown, activated remote turrets, then raced to the hangar to prepare escape vectors for the others. They didn't know how he did it. They didn't know how close they came to death. They just knew they were still alive. And when the threat was gone, when silence returned, when the base cooled down and the stars became still again, they said nothing. No medals, no speeches, just a silent nod from Hera. And that was enough. Because he had seen enough war to know that the ones who make it through often carry more than anyone ever sees. He didn't need to be understood. He just needed them safe. And so, as the galaxy turned and the war raged, the base remained. Named after a droid, maintained by a ghost. And every time the wind howled through its corridors, it sounded almost like him, laughing, mocking, protecting, watching, forever. The sky above Lothal burned orange when he heard it. Not the scream of TIE engines, not the thunder of artillery, but her voice, Hera's voice, cracked, trembling, still trying to lead, still trying to fight. But this time, she was calling for help, and she wasn't hiding it. Chopper, C1-10P, didn't hesitate. It wasn't because he was programmed to obey, or because the cause was just. It was because Hera needed him, and he was still her droid, even after all this time. Even after Kanan was gone, the last mission had broken them. Ezra had vanished into the unknown with Thrawn. Kanan had died in fire. And Hera tried to carry all of it alone. But Chopper had been watching her longer than anyone. He saw her lose pieces of herself every day. She still flew the ghost, still barked orders, still smiled when others looked. But when she thought no one was watching, her shoulders dropped like she was holding the whole rebellion in her arms. And maybe she was. When the ghost flew again, this time toward the Imperial Dome, it wasn't for hope. It was for closure, for Lothal, for Ezra. And Chopper didn't ask questions. He just rolled back into the co-pilot seat like nothing had changed. But everything had. The city was a prison now, a final fortress of the Empire. The people below didn't cheer the ghost. They didn't even look up. They were used to being forgotten. Chopper wasn't made for grand battles. His parts were scavenged. His arms squeaked. He didn't shine. But he was the one who sliced the dome's doors open, who disabled the shields, who rerouted the turbo lasers to fire on their own hangars. No one saw him do it. No one gave him orders. He just moved, quiet, efficient, angry, because Hera had tears in her voice, because Sabine hadn't said a word in hours, because they were all pretending not to feel what they felt, that Ezra was gone, and they were still here. Chopper didn't understand the Force. He didn't need to. He understood pain, silence, the kind that follows when someone doesn't come back. That day, he became more than just Spectre 3. He became the memory of them all. He remembered the way Zeb used to laugh, the way Ezra used to argue with him just to see if he could win, the way Kanan used to rest a hand on his dome and whisper something only Chopper could hear. He kept all of it, stored in circuits no one could access. And when the Imperial Dome exploded, and the people of Lothal looked up in wonder, they didn't know the ghost was already gone, slipping into the clouds like a fading dream. No medals, no speeches, only loss. And maybe something more. In the quiet that followed, Hera didn't say anything. She just placed a hand on Chopper's dome, gentle, grateful. He didn't beep, didn't protest, because for once he didn't need to. Ezra was gone, but they weren't alone. Not yet. After the liberation, Lothal changed. But not in the way stories say it did. There were no grand banners of the rebellion, no fleets guarding the skies, just silence and soil, and hope that felt too fragile to speak aloud. Chopper, C1-10P, stayed, not because he had a mission, not because anyone told him to, but because Ezra had once whispered something to him, something soft and strange. If I don't come back, make sure she's okay. And he understood, even if the words made his circuits ache. Hera stayed too, for a time, to help rebuild, to be a symbol. People came to her for guidance, for stories about Ezra, for wisdom about the Force. But they avoided Chopper. Most didn't even speak to him. To them, he was just a machine, the loud one, the rude one. But he didn't care, because every day he watched Hera walk through Ezra's old haunts. He watched her sit alone on the ghost, staring out at nothing. And he was there, always close, never too far. Sometimes he would play an old recording, just static at first, then a voice. Ezra, young, still full of light. Come on, Chopper, don't be like that. He only played it once. She just loud enough for her to hear. She didn't turn, didn't speak, but she didn't leave the cockpit either. That was enough. Later, when the new republic began forming, offers came. Positions, ranks, fleet commands. Hera said no to most, but she said yes to one thing, carrying Ezra's story, his legacy. She turned the ghost into more than a ship. It became a lesson, a memory, a reminder of what was lost. Chopper modified it again, not to fight, but to endure. He made its systems quieter, more stable. He added redundancies where none were needed, because the ghost was old now, like him, and he wasn't going to let her fall apart. He became her co-pilot again, not just in war, but in grief. Some nights she would speak, not to him, but near him. Do you think he's out there? He never responded, because he didn't know how. And maybe she wasn't asking him anyway. But once, when the stars were especially clear, he reached out with one of his arms and gently tapped her hand. She didn't flinch. She just looked at him, eyes tired, and smiled. Thanks, Chop. It was the only time she said his name without command. There was a moment on Lothal's cliffs. Quiet, windswept. Hera stood alone, watching the dawn. Chopper hovered beside her. They didn't speak. There was no ceremony. But something changed that day. Not in the galaxy, not in the war, but in them. They weren't just soldier and droid anymore. They were survivors of something that couldn't be named. And as the sun rose, casting light on the fields where children now played, Chopper stayed still, watching, remembering, guarding, just like Ezra would have wanted. There was no grand speech, no last goodbye, no time to process the shatter that came next. When Kanan Jarrus died, the galaxy didn't tremble, but the ghost did. It was the kind of silence that Chopper, C1-10P, had never known, not even in the wreckage of Ryloth, not even in the empty void between hyperspace jumps. This was something deeper, the sound of a broken family. And like always, he stayed. The ghost had no captain now, no compass. Hera tried to hold them together, but her fire had turned inward. Sabine painted, Zeb trained, Ezra wandered, and Chopper just watched. He watched Hera sit in the cockpit, but never lift off. He watched Ezra stare into stars, chasing voices he couldn't name. He watched the hallway lights flicker, because nobody remembered to fix them but him. Chopper never said a word, but he never stopped moving. Every corridor, every panel, every mission left unfinished. He handled it because someone had to. He wasn't a strategist, wasn't a warrior. He couldn't replace Kanan, but he could carry the weight. Not the emotional one, that was impossible, but the practical, the mechanical, the unseen. The kind of support nobody thanks you for, the kind you don't notice until it's gone. The plan to liberate Lothal wasn't born out of hope. It was born out of grief. Ezra had changed, quieter, sharper. He carried something in his voice now, not just purpose, but pain. He'd seen too much, lost too much. And when he decided to make his move, no one stopped him. Chopper didn't ask why. He just went. The mission began like many others. Coordinates, targets, transmissions. Jam the signal, slice the feed, redirect the attention, distract the probe droids, disable the doors. Quietly, precisely, and yet something felt different this time. Not because of the Empire, but because of Ezra. Chopper followed him into the heart of Lothal's capital, into the belly of the Imperial Dome, past cameras, stormtroopers, turbolifts, and traps. Every step felt final, every hallway a countdown. The boy who once relied on him like an older brother was now walking ahead like a man ready to disappear. And when Ezra looked back one last time, Chopper froze. He didn't beep. He didn't protest. He didn't try to stop him. Because somehow, in that brief glance, he understood. This wasn't a mission they were all meant to come back from. Ezra bridged the gap between Jedi and Rebel. He'd become both, and yet neither. And like so many before him, he chose sacrifice. Chopper stayed behind, to reroute systems, to delay backup, to scramble the Empire's surveillance, to make sure the path stayed clear. And then, the dome lifted into the sky, and Ezra Bridger was gone. The city didn't cheer. Not yet. The battle still raged. The Empire didn't fall in a single explosion. But in that moment, the tide turned. And Chopper, alone on the landing pad, just watched the sky. No emotion, no sound, just the slow spin of his dome, and a grief deeper than wires could express. When the transmission came through, confirming the dome's destruction, Hera's voice cracked. Sabine fell to her knees. Zeb turned away, and Chopper powered down his main photoreceptor. He didn't want to see anyone. Not right now. Not because he was broken, but because for the first time since Ryloth, he didn't want to be strong. Time didn't move the same after Lothal. The Empire never reclaimed the planet. The rebellion grew stronger. Phoenix Cell evolved into the larger alliance. Bases rose and fell. Leaders came and went. But Chopper, C1-10P, stayed with the Ghost. The ship was quieter now. Rooms that once echoed with arguments and laughter now held only silence. Ezra's bunk remained untouched. Kanan's seat left vacant. Hera flew missions again, but she was never quite the same. A little softer, a little older, a little more distant. And in every hollow moment, it was Chopper who kept the ship alive. He maintained its engines, cleaned its conduits, updated its codes, not because anyone asked him to, but because nobody else would. For Chopper, time had always been about function, charging, computing, serving. But somewhere after Lothal, time became memory. Every panel he repaired reminded him of someone. A scrape near the galley door from when Ezra and Zeb wrestled over rations. The dent behind the co-pilot's seat from when Sabine threw a hydrospanner during an argument. The faded scorch mark near the ramp left by Kanan's lightsaber when it slipped. They were just flaws. Small, meaningless. But to Chopper, they were proof the family had been real. The galaxy outside kept burning. The war wasn't over. But Lothal had become a symbol, not just of victory, but of sacrifice. And somehow, without ever asking, the people of that world chose to honor the one who had stayed. They called it Chopper Base. Not because he was the leader, not because he won the battle, but because, without him, none of it would have worked. It was a name given out of quiet respect, the kind that isn't celebrated, the kind you whisper, the kind you remember long after the heroes are gone. Chopper didn't react when he first heard it. No excited whistle, no spinning dome, just stillness, like he didn't know how to feel about it. Or maybe didn't feel like he deserved it. He never asked for medals, never needed validation, but to have a base named after him. It was the first time the galaxy saw him as something more than metal, more than a tool, more than a war machine, more than a relic from a dead war. It was strange. All his life, he'd fought to be useful, to prove he mattered. Now, his name stood still while the galaxy moved on. And yet, he kept going. He served in the final days of the rebellion, witnessed the fall of the Emperor, watched as new wars began to rise from old shadows. But even as the stars shifted and systems changed hands, one truth remained. He was the soul of the Ghost, not because he was powerful, not because he was programmed that way, but because he refused to leave. He was there for the first fight and for the last farewell. And when people remembered the rebellion, they remembered Leia, Mon Mothma, Cassian, Luke. But somewhere beneath the noise, in the quiet corners of the story, there was a small, scarred astromech with a broken leg, a bent antenna, and a past heavier than most Jedi could carry. He never said goodbye. He never needed to, because Chopper, C1-10P, never truly left. He was built to survive, but he chose to stay, and in doing so, became more than a machine. He became memory. The galaxy declared victory. Statues of the Emperor were torn down. Stormtrooper helmets rolled through the dust. But inside the Ghost, one droid didn't believe it. He had seen too many endings to trust this one. For Chopper, C1-10P, the war didn't end. It just got quiet. Kanan was gone. Ezra was gone. Even Sabine had disappeared into the unknown regions. Hera was still there, but different. Her voice was softer now, her eyes more distant. She flew where they asked her to. She fought the battles they gave her. But some part of her had stayed behind, still standing on that tower in Lothal, watching the stars. And Chopper stayed too. Not because he was ordered, not because anyone expected it, but because that's what he did. He stayed. He had been built for war, damaged in it, repaired in it, unchanged by it. He was never meant to survive peacetime. But peace never really came. It just moved its shape. The flags were different. The names were new. But the galaxy still bled. They called it the New Republic. And Hera Syndulla, now a general, carried its flag across forgotten systems. Corellia, Ciatos, Garrel. Worlds that once mattered, and now mattered again, only for what they could give. And behind her, silent and rusted, rolled the droid that once cursed at his allies and jammed Imperial signals with the same spike. They didn't understand what Chopper had lost. They never could. Because for them, the loss was distant. It was a friend, a teammate, a commander. But for Chopper, it was everything. The boy who vanished, Ezra, had given him something no one else ever had. A reason to stop running. A place to belong. Not because of protocol, not because of programming, but because of connection. When Ezra went, something short-circuited inside Chopper. Not mechanically, not visibly, but deeper. In that strange space where droids feel things no one believes they do. He didn't say anything. He didn't change his voice. He didn't rewrite his code. But he stopped cracking jokes. He stopped complaining. He started listening more. In long flights, when Hera would sit alone in the cockpit and stare at empty hyperspace, Chopper would hover close by, not making noise, just there. When no one else stayed, he did. The new crew didn't understand him. They tried to upgrade him, paint over his old casing. One even suggested shutting him down permanently. Hera said nothing, just gave them a look. And that was enough, because Chopper wasn't a droid to her. He was family, and family doesn't get replaced. The missions kept coming. Quiet assignments, recon, escort, investigation. But for Chopper, there was only one mission left. One he never said out loud. One he never forgot. Find Ezra. He scanned every sector, intercepted every transmission, cross-checked every irregular signal for signs of the boy who saved a planet and vanished into myth. The ghost felt emptier with every passing cycle. Even the engines didn't hum the same. But still, he stayed. Quiet, loyal, watching stars that might hide a face he hadn't seen in years. The war was over, but peace had never felt so hollow. Because the people who mattered were gone. And the galaxy only remembered the ones who shouted, not the ones who listened. Corellia was no longer a shipyard of dreams. It had become a scavenger's world, full of broken freighters, rusted Empire tech, and engineers with no cause. But Chopper, C1-10P, rolled through its alleys like he belonged there, because he had seen places like this before, in the Clone Wars, in the Rebellion, and now in whatever came after. This wasn't his first time searching in silence. He remembered the years before Hera, before the ghost, when all he had was a burnt-out escape pod and static in his circuits. He had survived those days by refusing to shut down. He was surviving now the same way. Hera had orders from the New Republic: decommission old Imperial plants, hunt ex-ISB agents, root out loyalist networks. But she had another mission too, the one no one spoke of. Find Thrawn. Find Ezra. The bridge crew said it was just a rumor, that Grand Admiral Thrawn was long gone. that Ezra was dust. But Chopper didn't argue. He just listened. And when no one noticed, he patched himself into every nav system and rerouted his scans. He wasn't chasing data. He was chasing ghosts. The stars felt colder out here. Even with new allies, droids, pilots, tacticians, nothing felt right. The ghost still flew, but it didn't soar. Its heart was quiet. And in that quiet, Chopper worked. He kept Hera going, repaired what others ignored. He knew when her hands shook after each briefing. He noticed when her voice paused at Ezra's name. He made sure she never flew alone. On Ciatos, something changed. The forest didn't welcome them. The sky above felt like it watched. Strange lights, unknown tech, old echoes. It reminded Chopper of other dark places, of Malachor, of Mustafar, of Lothal before the liberation. He didn't trust what the scanners showed. Some things weren't meant to be seen, but they were here now, looking, hoping. Hera gave the orders, but Chopper moved first, through fallen satellites, across ancient hyperspace rings, into signals that pulsed like memories. He searched, not because anyone told him to, but because Ezra would have done the same. There were moments in the night when the ghost hovered in orbit and the crew had gone quiet, that Chopper would roll to the edge of the viewport, alone. He would play back old files, static-filled transmissions, laughter that didn't echo anymore. And sometimes, just for a second, he thought he heard something, a flicker in the silence, a boy's voice, a frequency only memory could carry, but it always faded. Still, he kept listening, because if Ezra was out there, lost in some fracture of space, hidden beyond the rim, Chopper wouldn't stop, not until he heard him again. Even if no one believed, even if it meant wandering without orders, without masters, without maps. That was the thing about loyalty. It didn't need a reason, just a memory. There was a day when Hera stopped asking, stopped checking the sensors, stopped pretending the Senate still cared. The galaxy was moving on, celebrating victory, rebuilding fleets, debating politics, but not Chopper. C1-10P. He didn't care about medals or monuments. He cared about the seat that stayed empty. When missions ended and the ghost returned to base, Chopper didn't power down like the other droids. He stayed awake, restless, watching the stars shift, watching Hera sleep with her hand still near the comm. Some said droids couldn't feel grief, that they were just machines with programs and patterns. But Chopper didn't believe that, because he remembered. He remembered Ezra's laugh, the way he stole food from the ration tray, the way he called Chopper a bucket of bolts, and still patted his dome like a friend. He remembered the sound of Ezra's boots on the ghost, the way he always asked if Chopper was okay after a mission, even when no one else did. And he remembered the last goodbye. Not a word, not a command, just a look, a signal only they understood. Ezra didn't ask Chopper to follow. He knew he would try. And so he made sure he couldn't. That memory replayed every cycle, and every time it stung deeper. Others tried to fix Chopper, tried to upgrade his voice modulator, reprogram his navigation, wipe the corrupted sectors in his memory banks. But he refused, not with words, with resistance. He'd fry circuits before letting them erase a single byte of Ezra, because to forget would be a second death. The Senate sent new protocol droids, sleek, compliant, polished. They followed rules, spoke in standard, wore insignia like medals. But Chopper didn't salute. He remembered when the Empire wore uniforms too. On the mission to Garrel, he short-circuited a new droid's logic core just to delay the briefing. Not out of malice, but because Hera hadn't eaten in 2 days, and he knew she'd only rest if there was a malfunction. That's how Chopper cared. Not with hugs, with sabotage. He wasn't built to comfort, he was built to survive. But somehow, survival had become its own form of love. When Zeb visited, he brought silence. No jokes, no jabs, just quiet nods. Chopper appreciated that. Sabine left sketches, once, of Ezra, of the crew. Chopper scanned them all into his archive and never told anyone. They found a signal once, deep in the ghost lines of hyperspace. A whisper, unintelligible. But Hera froze. Sabine cried. Chopper played it on loop for 6 days. Not because it made sense, but because it made her feel something. That was his mission now. Keep the memory alive. Keep the ship running. Keep Ezra's name from vanishing. Not from the galaxy. From them. Because sometimes the war doesn't end when the Empire falls. Sometimes it ends when the last person forgets what they fought for. And Chopper, C1-10P, wouldn't let that happen. The stars kept moving, but he didn't. The Ghost had traveled through more wars than most ships survived. It had outlived Kanan, outlived the Empire, outlived the last time anyone believed Ezra Bridger was still alive. But it hadn't outlived Chopper. C1-10P. He stayed. There were days when Hera flew alone, just her and Chopper. No crew, no orders, just empty coordinates on the Navy computer and a destination that never came. They'd drift past Lyra San, past Onderon, once past Malachor. Quiet, unspoken detours that meant something only to those who remembered. And Chopper remembered all of them. He still recorded every signal, every fragment, every anomaly in hyperspace, even when others stopped caring, because maybe, just maybe, one of those pulses might be him, Ezra. Hera would never say it, not out loud, not anymore. But Chopper could feel it in the way she sat still in the pilot seat longer than necessary, in the way she avoided the back of the ship where Ezra's bunk still remained untouched, in the way she sometimes whispered to the stars without realizing it. He wanted to tell her he understood, but he couldn't, not with words. So he stayed close. When the Senate pulled her back into duty, Chopper followed, always just behind, always watching. When the Phantom was docked on Cetos and the map burned in Sabine's hands, Chopper was already scanning the echoes of whatever force trick had cloaked the pathway. He couldn't use the force, but he could feel Hera's ache, Sabine's silence, Jason's confusion. And so he worked. Through endless data files, through encrypted signals, through half-destroyed transmissions from the Eye of Sion, he found pieces others missed. Not because he was smarter, but because he never stopped. Because he believed. He believed that a boy who vanished with the stars hadn't become stardust. He believed in a rebel who always had one more trick. And he believed in a promise that was never spoken, but always understood, that family doesn't disappear. Not really. One night, Hera stood by the viewport, alone. She hadn't slept in 2 days. She hadn't eaten in 1. She whispered, "I don't know what I'm still hoping for." Chopper didn't beep, didn't whir. He just played a sound, soft and faded, from cycles ago. It was Ezra's voice, from the Ghost's hallway, laughing. Just once, then silence. Hera froze, closed her eyes, and for a moment, the war wasn't real. The losses weren't final, and that was enough. That was Chopper's gift. Not power, not glory, memory. In a galaxy that forgets too easily, he remembered. Every scar on the hull, every laugh in the galley, every moment that made them more than soldiers. He never stopped searching, even when others told him it was over, even when they said Ezra was gone, because Chopper, C1-10P, knew better. He had seen Jedi fall, he had seen Sith rise, he had seen planets burn and empires crumble, but he had never seen Ezra Bridger give up. So neither would he. The galaxy could move on, but he stayed, the last loyal spark of a ghost crew, the final echo of a forgotten rebellion, the droid who never stopped waiting. And in the quiet of deep space, where only old ships and older memories roam, Chopper, C1-10P, still listens for a voice, for a signal, for home. The war was over, or at least that's what they said. But for Chopper, C1-10P, the signal never ended. Long after the Empire's banners fell, after the Death Stars turned to dust, and after the battle cries faded from the sky, the droid's internal systems still ran cold diagnostics at dawn, still checked for ghost signals, still waited for orders from voices that no longer spoke, because peace was just another kind of silence, and silence always meant something was broken. Chopper had no soul, no heart, no force running through him, but inside his wires there was something else, something older, something harder to erase, memory of flight paths that only Kanan knew, of hyperspace jumps when Ezra didn't wait for permission, of sabotage missions Hera never approved, but always smiled about later. He remembered the thrill in Sabine's voice when she asked him to cover her escape, the sharp snap of Zeb's punch on the side panel when he got too smug, and he remembered Lothal, the sky glowing like it would never fade, Ezra's voice calling to him through static, a voice that never returned. Years passed. Systems updated, orders changed, but Chopper never rewired that part. To most, he looked the same, grumpy, clanking, full of unintelligible sounds that somehow everyone understood. But there was less light in him now. His dome spun slower, his tone buzzed duller, and when he powered down each night, it was just a little longer before he came back online. The galaxy moved forward, the New Republic rose, but Chopper wasn't built for after. He was built for during. He was built for rebellion. He followed Hera, not because he had to, but because she was the last piece that still remembered the same war he did. Together, they drifted from battlefields to briefings, from senators to smugglers. She wore a new uniform now, but the sorrow in her eyes had the same weight. The Ghost was docked more than it flew, and when it did fly, it felt heavier, even if the cargo hold was empty. One night, on a quiet orbit above Corellia, Chopper picked up something strange. A pulse, weak, buried, but not random. It was too slow to be a distress beacon, too intentional to be background noise, and too familiar to ignore. He played it for Hera, just a soft, repeating rhythm through the ship's speakers. Ba-dum, pause. Ba-dum, pause. Ba-dum. She froze. It's not him, she whispered. It can't be. But her voice broke halfway through the sentence. Because they both knew. Ezra Bridger didn't do accidents. And if he left a signal, it wasn't for the Republic. It wasn't even for Ahsoka. It was for them. For the crew of the Ghost. For the only family that never stopped listening. Chopper didn't wait for orders. That night, when Hera slept, he adjusted the Ghost's scanners, narrowed the range, increased the sensitivity, calculated the drift of the signal through decades of static and stardust. Ciatos, a name that came back with the pulse, a system buried in myths and exiled archives, a planet the Jedi once knew but never spoke of, a place where stars twisted too close and time felt wrong. But Chopper didn't fear places like that, because he had already lived through the worst timelines. So he watched, calculated, waited. And when Hera gave the nod, the kind that wasn't really approval, just surrender, Chopper locked in the course. He didn't hope. He didn't wonder. He remembered. Ezra's voice in the halls, his footsteps in the cockpit, his laugh echoing off metal. And even though he knew memory could lie, Chopper followed it anyway. Because sometimes, in the dark, memory is all that speaks. And when it does, you listen. The galaxy called it peace. But to Chopper, C1-10P, it felt like the slow collapse after a battle, not quiet, just numb. The kind of silence that crept into starships and made even the engines feel like they were whispering. After the Cetos signal, things moved quickly. Ahsoka returned. Ezra stood again among them. Sabine was different. Older, heavier, but still carrying fire beneath the surface. The ghost wasn't just a memory anymore. For a moment, it was whole, but something was missing. It wasn't just Kanan. It wasn't just the Jedi. It was the war. Not the war against the Empire. That was over, they said. But a war deeper than banners and blasters. A war Chopper still felt humming through the data streams of old battlefields. A war that never had a name, because no one wanted to admit it had begun again. The shadows of Thrawn loomed large. The New Republic called him a remnant, a ghost. But Chopper had fought too long to mistake preparation for defeat. He watched the faces in every hangar bay, the cargo runs that felt more like military convoys, the way Hera clenched her jaw when senators spoke of budget cuts. This wasn't victory, it was a pause. Ezra tried to smile, tried to act like everything was behind him. But his eyes were never still. He scanned crowds like a soldier still checking for snipers. He kept the lights on at night. He walked as if gravity itself didn't trust him. Chopper didn't ask. He didn't beep or buzz with concern. He just followed. Sometimes that meant trailing Ezra through quiet districts on Lothal, or sitting silently in the co-pilot's seat as hyperspace tore the stars apart again. Sometimes it meant nothing at all, just staying powered on longer, in case the boy who vanished needed something and couldn't say it out loud. Sabine felt it too. She painted less, talked less, slept less. They were all waiting for something to break again. One night, in the outer rings, Chopper intercepted an encrypted message. It wasn't official. It wasn't coded like Republic chatter. It was old, dirty, full of static. But the pattern was unmistakable. Imperial. The kind that hadn't been used since Endor. The kind that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Chopper played it for Ezra in the Ghost's cargo bay. The boy froze. "It's him," Ezra said quietly. He didn't mean Palpatine. He didn't mean Vader. He meant Thrawn. The Grand Admiral had survived, and he was calling something back. Not a fleet, not a base, a memory. A memory of control, of silence, of perfection. And it was echoing across the stars, looking for the broken pieces still loyal to him. The New Republic wouldn't listen. They saw numbers. Chopper saw patterns. War wasn't about numbers. It was about timing. And Thrawn was always ahead of time. The Ghost left quietly that cycle. No permission, no report. Ezra, Sabine, Hera, and Chopper. They chased the signal again, through abandoned outposts, cracked star destroyers, rusting training grounds where stormtrooper helmets still sat in the dirt. Chopper remembered these places. He had been here before, not physically, but in battle data, in mission logs, in the stories of those who didn't make it back. Each location whispered something to him. Loyalty, obedience, ruin. He recorded everything, because that's what he was built to do, to remember what others wanted to forget. At the edge of wild space, they found what they weren't supposed to find. A facility still running, lights still blinking, a fleet, unfinished but not abandoned. And among the signals, one clear tone, Bardum, pause, Bardum. Not Ezra's this time, not Thrawn's either. Chopper didn't know what it was, not exactly, but it matched the rhythm of something older than rebellion. Something the Republic never documented. A tone that said, we're still here, and we're still building. They thought he was outdated. That was the word the technicians used. Outdated, too loud, too damaged, too unstable to be trusted in a galaxy trying to rebuild itself. They looked at his bent struts and burned plating, and saw a relic that should have been shut down long ago. But Chopper, C1-10P, had outlived every war they studied. He had survived the Clone Wars. He had survived the rise of the Empire. He had survived the fall of Jedi, generals, and entire planets. Not because he was strong, because he refused to stop. When the hidden facility powered up its defenses, the others prepared for battle. Ezra reached for the Force. Sabine checked her charges. Hera took the pilot seat like she always had. And Chopper, C1-10P, slipped into the shadows. That was where he belonged. Inside the station, the corridors were cold and old, built with imperial precision, everything aligned, everything controlled. It reminded him of places he hated, places where individuality died quietly. The security systems recognized nothing human, but they recognized him. Old imperial identifiers blinked to life. Codes he hadn't used in decades still worked. Doors opened. Turrets hesitated. Protocols stalled. He wasn't supposed to exist anymore. That made him dangerous. He moved fast, cutting power, looping cameras, feeding false data into targeting arrays. Every second he bought them was another second Ezra could breathe. At one point, a blast struck him hard enough to throw him against the wall. His stabilizer failed. His dome cracked further. Warning lights flashed across his interface. He ignored them. Pain meant nothing to him. It always had. He kept moving. The station began to wake. Not fully alive, but aware. Systems communicating. Droids activating. A skeleton of an empire trying to remember how to stand again. Chopper, C1-10P, had seen that before too. He remembered when the empire was young, when it believed it was eternal, when it crushed worlds simply because it could. And he remembered how it fell, not in a single moment, but slowly, quietly, from inside. So he did what he had always done. He sabotaged. He rerouted the reactor's cooling flow just enough to destabilize it later. Not now, not yet. Later, when escape mattered, when timing meant survival. He locked blast doors behind enemy squads, overloaded power couplings, turned their own order against them. By the time Ezra felt the tremor through the Force, it was already too late. Chopper, Ezra whispered. The droid didn't respond. He was busy. When they regrouped in the hangar, smoke trailing through the ceiling, Hera saw him roll in, damaged, limping, sparking. She rushed toward him. Chop! He cut her off with a sharp buzz. Not now. The station was collapsing. They ran. The ghost lifted just as fire ripped through the facility's core. Metal folded inward. Systems screamed. And then silence. Another ghost erased. As the ship jumped to hyperspace, no one spoke. Ezra stared at Chopper, C1-10P, like he was seeing him for the first time. "You saved all of us," he said. Chopper made a small noise. Not proud, not angry, tired. Because this wasn't new. He had always saved them, and no one ever remembered to say it. Later, while repairs were underway, Ezra sat beside him in the quiet. "I didn't think you'd still be here," Ezra admitted. "After everything." Chopper's dome turned slightly. Still here. That was the point. He wasn't a Jedi. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't chosen by prophecy or the Force. He was just a droid who refused to shut down when the galaxy told him to. That night, as the ghost drifted between stars, Ezra fell asleep in the co-pilot's chair. Chopper, C1-10P, stayed awake, listening to the hum of the engines, watching the boy who came back from the void, and guarding what little peace they had left. Because the galaxy didn't need another hero. It needed someone who remembered how bad things could become. And Chopper, C1-10P, remembered everything. He didn't understand the peace. To him, the silence after war wasn't quiet. It was hollow, like waiting for something that had already happened, but no one told him. Ezra was back. Lothal was free. The Empire was dust. But Chopper, C1-10P, he just kept listening, watching, recording. Because droids don't forget. The ghost was older now. She had new parts, different sounds, but her corridors still echoed with the same ghosts. Kanan's calm footsteps, Sabine's spray can rattling, Hera's voice in the cockpit, half asleep, whispering star coordinates like lullabies, Ezra laughing through the comms, and him, always him, bickering, warning, fixing, yelling, filling the silence with noise so it wouldn't collapse in. But now the silence stayed. Ezra smiled when he returned, but it wasn't the same smile. There was weight behind his eyes, a darkness he didn't speak of, not because he was hiding something, but because it had become part of him. And Hera, she had waited too long to be whole again. Years of searching, of stubborn leadership, of holding the ghost together with grief and memory. Her hands shook when she first saw Ezra walk through the ship again, and Chopper, who had never once cried, turned away. He beeped something crude to cover the static building in his circuits. But after the welcome, after the war, after the missions were over, there was nothing left for him to do. No master, no orders, just memory. He roamed the ghost without reason, replaying recordings, pausing in doorways, hovering at the edge of the mess hall where nobody gathered anymore. His files were full, not with tactical data, but with things the galaxy didn't log. Sabine once fell asleep painting a portrait of Kanan. Hera covered her with a blanket without saying a word. Chopper logged the moment, stored it under 001-VULN-Hera-Sabine-Silent. Later, when Jason asked about his father, Chopper played no hollows. He just rested his metal claw on the boy's shoulder and beeped once. That file, too, was saved. 045-human-comfort-affirmation. He was a war droid, a killer, a saboteur, but he was also the only one left who remembered everything. Droids weren't supposed to be haunted, but sometimes he saw shadows on the ship, echoes of voices no one else heard. And sometimes Hera saw them too. She would stop mid-flight, turn her head, smile at nothing, and whisper, "Yeah, I remember." There was a mission once, quiet, cold, unrecorded. Hera was sent to help coordinate Republic logistics. Ezra was recovering somewhere in the Outer Rim. Sabine was hunting whispers of Imperial remnants. The Ghost docked near a ring station over a dead moon. Chopper wandered alone through the ship as usual, but this time he didn't stop at his usual loop. He powered down the central lights, turned on a long-forgotten playback from Lothal's skies. The sound of Kanan's voice distorted through the storm. "You'll never be alone, not while I'm here." And Chopper, whose programming was too old for emotion, stood still for 3 hours, motionless. Not because he understood death, but because he remembered the promise. Later, Jason found him there. The boy sat beside him on the cold metal floor. No questions, just presence. As if something in him also understood that memory was its own kind of mourning. Years passed like that. Ezra became a Jedi again. Sabine faded into legend. Hera kept flying. Jason grew taller. The galaxy shifted. But Chopper, he never changed. Just kept watching, kept remembering. He didn't want to be thanked. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted the story to stay real, to not be forgotten. Because the galaxy moved fast. People forgot fast. Wars were rewritten. Heroes became footnotes. But he had files. Of a Jedi who died with love in his eyes. Of a pilot who held the stars together with her will. Of a boy who disappeared with whales and came back as something different. Of a family that never really broke. And of a droid who wasn't supposed to feel anything, but somehow did. They called him malfunctioning, dangerous, problematic. But the truth was simple. He remembered too much. And in the quiet of hyperspace, while everyone else slept, Chopper, C1-10P, drifted through the ghost once more. Alone, awake, remembering.